Inside the courtroom, the mallet struck and the judge declared the defendant, Violette Vaughan, guilty and sentenced her to death. A young girl stepped forward, pleading for mercy on behalf of the condemned. She spoke of her sister with understanding, certain that there had been reasons behind her actions. The crowd stirred with murmurs. Some praised the girl's kindness, remarking on how generous she was to show mercy toward the very person who had tried to take her life. Others commented on why a certain prince had fallen so deeply for her. The girl was Maryjun, and she approached Violette with gentle reassurance, promising that everything would be all right and that she would make sure of it. But before she could finish her words, Violette struck her across the face and pulled away from her touch. The crowd turned on Violette immediately. Some called her vile, saying she was nothing compared to Maryjun. Others whispered that Violette was Maryjun's half-sister, calling her cold-blooded. 3 months before that moment, Violette had been locked away. Her crime was the attempted murder of her half-sister. Under normal circumstances, such an act would have led to her execution. But Maryjun had begged the court for a lesser punishment. There had been talk of sending Violette to a convent, though that plan eventually fell through. In the end, Violette was sentenced to spend the rest of her life in prison. Violette had always despised Maryjun. Her hatred had roots that ran deep, stretching back to her earliest years in the estate of Duke Vaughan in the kingdom of Durali. She had been born into a cold and loveless household. Her father had abandoned her mother for another woman, and her mother, consumed by grief and bitterness, had never shown Violette any warmth or affection. Not a single person in that house had ever felt like true family to her. Her mother's health eventually gave way, and she died when Violette was 16 years old. When her father returned home after that, he did not come back alone. He brought with him a small girl named Maryjun. Violette remembered clearly how that little girl had greeted her with bright enthusiasm, calling her a dear sister right away. To Violette, Maryjun had stolen everything she had ever longed for. She had 2 warm and loving parents. She was cherished and adored. She had been welcomed into the very home where Violette had spent years feeling invisible and unwanted. And then there was the prince. Violette had once confronted him, demanding to know why he had chosen Maryjun over her. He told her simply and plainly that he did not love her. Not long after that, word spread that the prince had proposed to Maryjun. Everyone around them rejoiced while Violette stood apart, her fists curled tightly at her sides. She could not understand why Maryjun had been given everything, while she herself had been left with nothing. The thought consumed her. If only Maryjun had never existed at all. On the night it happened, while Maryjun lay sleeping, Violette crept into her bedroom with a knife in her hand. Maryjun woke to find her there. In that moment, Violette had been driven entirely by years of pain and longing and rage. Later, sitting alone in her prison cell, leaning against the cold wall, Violette turned things over in her mind. It was obvious that everyone who loved Maryjun would hate Violette in return. She had reached out for the love she had always wanted and had been punished for it. When she tried to lift herself up, her body gave out and she collapsed to the ground. She had not eaten properly in months and had lost all appetite since her imprisonment began. She was terribly weak, and the world around her was growing dim and blurry. She thought to herself that she had not wanted any of this. She wondered if this was truly how it would end for her. The life she had lived, soaked in hatred and envy, made her sick inside. All she had ever truly wanted was to be loved. She found herself wondering whether things might have gone differently. Tears slid down her face. She told herself there was no use asking such a question anymore. It was far too late. Then, without warning, the cell filled with a sudden and overwhelming light. Violette squinted against the brightness. Someone was calling her name. A maid pulled open the blinds of a window and wished her a cheerful good morning. Violette sat up from her bed in complete confusion. She was in her own room. Standing before her was Maryjun, their household maid. She could not tell whether she was dreaming. Maryjun set a cup of tea on the bedside table and spoke warmly about the morning's blend and the lovely weather outside. Violette stared at her in a daze, wondering privately if she had died. But when the tea was offered to her, the scent hit her in a way that felt deeply familiar. She had always loved Maryjun's tea. She took a sip and let out a sharp sound of surprise, startling Maryjun. She quickly recovered herself, insisting that nothing was wrong and that Maryjun should not be concerned. She sat there quietly, trying to make sense of what was happening. The taste was real. The warmth was real. It was not a dream. She could not understand how she was sitting here freely when she should have been behind bars. Maryjun gently suggested that Violette must still be worn out, especially after having met Maryjun the day before. She mentioned that there was a tea party scheduled for that afternoon and that she would prepare a light breakfast in the meantime. Violette was caught off guard hearing this. Maryjun went on to say that the party was set for 4 o'clock, that it would be a grand affair, and that it was to be Maryjun's debut. Something slowly began to dawn on Violette. After she had dressed and prepared herself, Maryjun offered a warm compliment on how lovely she looked. Violette thanked her and sent her out of the room. Alone, she picked up her diary. The most recent entry was from a long time ago. When she worked out the date, she realized that today was exactly 1 year in the past. She remembered now. The royal family had hosted this very tea party shortly after her father had remarried. If her understanding was correct, She had somehow traveled back in time. She could not grasp how such a thing was possible, but she recalled clearly that in prison she had wished desperately for the chance to do things over. Maryjun called to her from outside the door, reminding her that it was nearly time to leave. Violette felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. It was almost too much to take in. For now, she had no choice but to go. At the tea party, the guests filled the room with chatter. When the Vahan family arrived, people took notice right away. There was open speculation about Maryjun and whether she was the Duke's child born outside of his marriage. Maryjun stood out in the crowd just as Violette remembered her doing. Her father's second wife had married him after the death of Violette's own mother, the original Duchess, and their daughter was roughly the same age as Violette herself. The onlookers stared at Violette with expressions full of sympathy, and it was plain to see exactly what thoughts were passing through all of their minds. Violette kept walking through the gathering. She remembered how she had once made full use of her standing in moments like this one. In her past life, she had played up her position and used it as a weapon against Maryjun. Now she could not help but wonder if she was being punished somehow, forced to relive every wrong thing she had ever done. The memories of her cruelty came flooding back to her all at once. Then she heard a familiar voice calling out her nickname. A young man appeared through the crowd, holding a plate piled with sweets, clearly having gone out of his way to find her. Violette recognized him immediately. It was Yulon. He held the plate out toward her cheerfully, pleased with himself for having picked out the best ones for her. Violette thanked him warmly. Yulon Kyugers was a childhood friend, 1 year younger than Violette. He was the only person who knew the full truth of her family's story, every painful detail of it. He was one of the very few people she had ever genuinely trusted. Yulon came from a prominent background himself, being part of the royal family through his father, who served the king as Duralia's prime minister. Violette remarked that it had been quite a while since she had seen him, and the moment the words left her mouth she panicked. The phrase had slipped out without thinking. In truth, she had not seen Yulon since the day she was thrown into prison, which in this timeline had not yet happened. She quickly recovered herself and offered an explanation, saying the last time she had seen him had been when she was greeting the king. Yulon accepted this without suspicion. Violette reminded herself to be far more careful. She had gone back an entire year and could not afford to let anything like that slip again. Yulon brought up that he had heard about her father's remarriage and that she now had a stepsister. He asked gently if she was doing all right. The question caught Violette off guard. She thought back to how consumed she had been in her previous life, so obsessed with bringing Maryjun down that she had blocked out everything and everyone else around her. She had not noticed at the time that Yulon had genuinely been worried about her. The realization moved her, and she smiled at him and told him she was perfectly fine. Inside, she was quietly amazed at herself for having taken so long to see what had been right in front of her. Yulon pressed her once more, making sure she was truly all right. She assured him that she was. A moment later, a woman with an umbrella appeared and called to Violette, asking her to come inside with her. Violette agreed and went along, though she struggled privately to recall exactly who the woman was. She gave Yulon a small wave as she left, and he remained behind, watching her go. As she walked, Violette turned things over in her mind. She would be lying to herself if she claimed that Maryjun no longer affected her in any way. The feelings were still there, but she had learned, through tremendous suffering, that letting hatred for Maryjun guide her actions had destroyed her life. As long as she kept her distance from Maryjun and did not allow herself to be drawn in, she told herself she would be fine. Then, just a short distance away, something happened that she could not ignore. A woman deliberately tipped a cup of tea onto Maryjun, offering an insincere apology and pretending that her hand had simply slipped. The people nearby murmured among themselves, noting the ruin of Maryjun's beautiful gown. Violette looked at Maryjun's tearful eyes and felt something twist inside her. She had wanted to stay away, and yet here was Maryjun, caught off guard and defenseless. The woman standing beside Violette whispered with quiet satisfaction that Maryjun had gotten exactly what she deserved. It came back to Violette then. Her former companions had always trailed after her, feeding off her resentment toward Maryjun. They had known how Violette felt and had used that as permission to torment Maryjun at every opportunity. They had been cruel in ways that went far beyond anything Violette had even directed. Deep down, Violette had always understood that they were not doing it out of any real loyalty to her. They simply used Maryjun as an easy target to take out their own bitterness. Maryjun, for her part, had stood quietly and said nothing. And Violette knew, honestly, that she herself had been just as petty as any of them. Without fully thinking it through, she reached into her things and offered Maryjun a handkerchief. Before anything more could happen, a sharp voice cut through the air nearby, demanding to know what was going on. Violette's eyes went wide. She knew that voice. The women around her scattered at the sight of Prince Claudia, visibly frightened, stood before them demanding an explanation for what had taken place at his family's tea party. Prince Claudia Acrusis, the man next in line to rule over Duralia. No one in that kingdom would dare defy him. Violette spoke up, addressing the prince directly. She stepped forward and offered an explanation, saying that the woman responsible understood she had behaved badly and that Violet herself would personally see to it that the woman was reprimanded. She asked the prince to let the matter rest there. The prince looked at her and said that he understood now, but his understanding was not the kind Violet had hoped for. He accused her of having orchestrated the whole thing from a distance, using her followers to do the dirty work while keeping her own hands clean. Also, she could torment her own family without appearing directly responsible. He looked at her with open contempt and told her she was only making herself look foolish. Violet was stunned. She had not done anything this time. But before she could speak, Maryjun stepped between them and came to Violet's defense, insisting to the prince that Violet had actually been kind to her. The prince acknowledged who Maryjun was but dismissed her words, suggesting that she simply felt obligated to protect Violet out of some sense of duty or goodness. Violet stood there with her head bowed, irritated and quietly resigned. She had known something like this would happen. The prince was not wrong about who she had been. She had bullied Maryjun, and there was no arguing against a history she could not undo. And beyond that, she knew how this story would eventually go. These two would fall deeply in love within the year. There was nothing to be gained by fighting it. Her heart beat faster. She remembered vividly how the prince had once screamed at her, calling her a harpy who had tried to take Maryjun's life. She remembered trying to defend herself that day and how useless it had been. Standing here now, the same outrage from that memory rose up inside her involuntarily. Then Yulan's voice came from just behind her. She turned, startled to find him there. He addressed the prince calmly, mentioning that more desserts had been brought outside and suggesting lightly that he and Violet slip away before they were all gone. The prince was taken aback, clearly not having noticed when Yulan had come in. Yulan apologized smoothly for the interruption and noted that since he and Violet were bystanders in the matter, the two of them would excuse themselves. The prince tried to stop them, insisting he had not finished. But Yulan pressed on, pointing out clearly that no one had actually confirmed that Violet had asked anyone to confront Maryjun, and that the prince had not given Violet any opportunity to explain herself before leaping to his conclusions. Yulan said he had great respect for the prince and had no intention of being disrespectful, but noted plainly that disputes were best settled between the people actually involved in them, and that outside interference only made things worse. He said this without any hostility, simply as a matter of reason. With that, he guided Violet away and left the prince standing there without a word to say. Once they were outside, Violet turned to Yulan, troubled by what he had just done. She asked him why he had spoken to the prince that way and worried aloud about what might happen to him if the prince decided to punish him for his boldness. Yulan told her not to worry and assured her that he would be fine. Violet began to argue the point, but Yulan cut her off gently, telling her simply that he knew she had had nothing to do with what happened to Maryjun, and that the prince had had no real grounds to scold her the way he did. Violet opened her mouth to respond, but Yulan moved on quickly, suggesting they put the whole thing behind them and focus on the desserts waiting for them, not wanting anything to go stale. He said cheerfully that he was feeling quite hungry. Violet looked at him quietly as he walked ahead. She thought to herself that this particular conversation had never happened the first time around. Things were already unfolding differently than before, and she was not entirely sure how it would all play out. At the buffet table, Violet and Yulan fell into easy conversation. She recalled that he had never been fond of sweets, and he confirmed it, admitting that he had always preferred sour things instead. They exchanged a few light words about fruit and how sweet it tended to be. It was a small and simple exchange, but a comfortable one. Neither of them noticed that from behind a nearby window, Prince Claudia had been watching them the entire time. He sat stiffly, his jaw tight, observing the two of them together. He eventually pulled himself away and returned to where Maryjun was seated across from him, excusing himself quietly. Maryjun, meanwhile, had noticed something on the ground nearby. She reached down and picked it up. It was a handkerchief, and she turned it over in her hands, quietly wondering whether it had belonged to Violet. Later that evening, the family returned home. Violet reflected on the day as she settled in. She had somehow made it through the tea party without things going too badly, but something was sitting uneasily with her. She had not thanked Yulan. He had stepped in on her behalf and drawn the prince's displeasure onto himself, and it had happened because of her. She felt she owed him her gratitude and resolved to find a way to express it properly. Her thoughts were interrupted when her father called out to her and asked her to come with him. Once they were together, he brought up the matter of Maryjun's stained dress. He told Violet that when he had asked Maryjun about it, the girl had stayed completely silent and offered no explanation. He turned to Violet directly and asked her, plainly and without softening the question, whether she had anything to do with it. Violet told him she had not. Inside, she felt the familiar sting of being assumed guilty before anything had been established. Her father had not even been present at the tea party, yet here he was, already pointing the finger at her. He went on to tell her that he had allowed her to behave as she pleased in the past, but that things were different now. She was no longer an only child. He expected her to conduct herself in a way that reflected well on the family and to look after Maryjun the way an older sister should. Violet told him she would keep that in mind, and the conversation ended there. But once she reached her room and sank into her pillows, the composed front she had maintained crumbled. The idea of being lectured about honoring the family by the very man who had abandoned his own struck her as deeply absurd. She rolled about on her bed, muttering to herself about the sheer nerve of it. She knew, of course, that the full picture was more complicated than simple blame. Her parents had married for political reasons rather than out of genuine feeling. Her mother had loved her father, but that love had never been returned in equal measure. Her father had been a handsome and gifted man, and even within his marriage, women had continued to seek his attention. Violet had watched her mother grow increasingly fixated on him over the years, consumed by a possessiveness that only deepened as the distance between them grew. Seen in that light, she supposed there was a version of events in which her father deserved some measure of pity too. Even so, she could not bring herself to feel warmly toward him. She had no desire to patch things up, and the very thought of reconciling with him made her shudder. He had been the one to start all of this. She pushed the thought aside and tried to think more practically about what lay ahead. A full day had now passed, and the reality of her situation had settled in firmly. This was not a dream or some trick of the mind. She had genuinely been sent back an entire year. And of all the moments to return to, it was this one, the very point when everything had first begun to unravel, when Maryjun had come into their home and the darkest chapter of Violet's life had started. She had absolutely no desire to live through that year again. She refused to let herself be eaten alive by jealousy a second time. But she also had no intention of pretending that everything was warm and harmonious when it was not. The idea of performing happiness within that household felt just as unbearable as the hatred she was trying to leave behind. Her mind began turning toward escape. She wondered whether simply running away might be the answer, and then immediately began thinking about how she would sustain herself if she did. Then an idea came to her, quiet but clear. The convent. In prison, she had learned a kind of work that could support her, and a convent was a place where she could put that to use and build a modest but stable life for herself. She could take the veil, leave her family behind entirely, and disappear from the world she had known. People would no longer connect her name to the Vahan family. She would not have to face Maryjun day after day. She could begin again from nothing. The more she sat with the idea, the more certain she felt. She would go to a convent, become a nun, and live out her days far removed from her family and everything that had caused her so much pain. That was the path she would take. Violet was sitting alone on a bench, absorbed in a book. A group of ladies nearby noticed her and admired how graceful she looked, though they remarked among themselves that she appeared to be troubled. One of them assumed it must be the book she was reading, imagining it to be something dense and difficult. Violet quietly closed the book. Its title was a guide on how to join a convent, a new edition. She let out a slow breath, genuinely puzzling over what it actually took to become a nun. To anyone watching, she was simply Violette Vahan, a noble young woman sitting alone with a book. But the truth of who she was ran much deeper than that. She was the girl who had been locked away for attempting to murder her half-sister in a consuming fit of jealousy. She had been on the very edge of death, had collapsed and lost consciousness, and had woken up to find herself thrown an entire year into the past. It was a miracle she could barely explain, but it had given her something she had never expected, a chance to live this year over again. She turned her attention back to the practical problem in front of her. The first step toward entering a convent was obtaining written permission from one's legal guardian. That meant her father. She could already picture how that conversation would go. Word would spread quickly that the Duke's daughter intended to take the veil, and her father would be furious, convinced she was doing it purely to humiliate him. The image of his reaction made her stomach tighten with irritation. Then another thought occurred to her. She did not necessarily need her father's permission at all. There was an age requirement to formally enter the convent, and she had not yet reached it. But if she could endure the next few years of school, she would eventually come of age and be able to seek permission from a more distant relative instead. The day she turned 18 could be the day she finally said goodbye to the Vahan name for good. Her thoughts were interrupted when a group of girls appeared and greeted her cheerfully, telling her they had been searching for her everywhere. They were her usual companions, the ones who had always trailed after her, and they invited her to join them for lunch in the garden, where their chef had prepared a special menu for them. Violet kept her expression pleasant and declined politely, saying she preferred to spend some time on her own and sending them off to enjoy themselves without her. As they drifted away, she could hear them whispering behind her. One remarked that Violet seemed low in spirits. Another supplied the reason, saying that Violet's half-sister had just transferred into a first-year class at the school. They assumed the whole situation must have thrown Violet completely off balance. Violet thought to herself that they were not entirely wrong, though things were different now. She could admit that she had been eaten alive by jealousy the first time around, but she had made herself a promise not to repeat those same mistakes. She walked down the hallway with her thoughts turning inward. She had a clear plan in her mind. If she made trouble, her father would begin watching her far more closely. The safest thing she could do was keep a low profile, stay away from her old social circle, and live quietly on the edges of things. Prince Claudia already thought poorly of her. She had already managed to put distance between herself and the people she used to spend her time with. If she could stay out of sight and out of trouble until she came of age, the convent would be her way out. The family scandal that everyone already knew about would work in her favor too, keeping people at a cautious distance without her having to do anything at all. She was still turning all of this over in her mind when she became aware that someone nearby was looking at her. A young man greeted her and offered to walk with her to the dining hall for lunch. Violet was caught off guard. Of all the people to run into, it was him. She greeted him back composedly. The young man was Lord Mila, known more familiarly to those around him as Mila. He was the student council vice president of the Royal Tanzanite Academy, a third-year student by the name of Mylania Dior. He was known for being sharp, even-tempered, and well-liked, particularly among the girls, several of whom were hovering nearby at that very moment. He remarked that it was unusual to see Violet on her own and asked after the friends she usually dined with. Violet replied that she had come to find some worth in being alone, and that the pleasant weather had made her want to buy her lunch and eat outside. She kept her tone light and easy. She was aware that she and Mila had known each other for years through their shared noble background, but they had never been particularly close. His sudden interest in talking to her was unexpected. Mila told her he was glad they had crossed paths because he had wanted to ask her something about the tea party the day before. He wanted to know what had happened between the prince and Yulan. Violet was surprised but explained the situation plainly. Mila seemed satisfied, confirming that nothing serious had come of it. A brief and slightly awkward silence followed before Milo acknowledged that he had led her into answering the question under somewhat false pretenses and apologized for it. He explained that the prince had been irritable all morning and that since Violet was Yulan's longtime friend, he had assumed she might know something. He noted that the prince only tended to sour when Yulan was involved. Violet understood the connection he was drawing. Yulan did have distant ties to the royal family, which meant he and Prince Claudio were related in some removed way. She decided there was no point in being evasive about it. She told Mila directly that there had been a dispute at the party and that she was the cause of it, not Yulan. She had been the one to make the prince lose face, and she expressed genuine regret for it. Mila was thoughtful as he took this in. He recalled that Yulan had defended Violet at the time, which had surprised him, since Yulan was known for going out of his way to avoid the prince. He had not expected Yulan to involve himself on anyone's behalf in a confrontation like that. Violet noted to herself that the incident at the party had apparently stirred up enough attention to bring Mila to her doorstep. It was exactly the kind of thing she had been hoping to avoid. She needed to be much more careful going forward. Then she noticed that Mila's gaze had shifted towards something beyond the window. She followed his eyes and saw Maryjun standing outside. Before she could process what she was seeing, a sense of urgency gripped her. She offered a quick apology to Mila, said something had just come to mind that she needed to attend to immediately, and hurried away. As she left, she did not notice Prince Claudia arriving nearby, his eyes following her as she rushed off. Outside the school building, Violet heard voices coming from around a corner, sharp and cutting. She moved carefully to see what was happening without being seen herself. What she found was exactly what she had feared. Maryjun was surrounded by a group of girls who were tearing into her with cruel words. They mocked her origins, called her mother a mistress, and said that the only reason the Duke had married her mother at all was because Maryjun had been born. They spoke as though Maryjun's very presence at the school was an act of shamelessness, insulting her bloodline with open contempt. Violet felt the weight of recognition settle over her. She had once brought Maryjun to that very spot to humiliate her. This scene had roots in her own past behavior, and she was standing in the middle of it now. She told herself she had no reason to intervene. She did not want to be pulled into it. Her plan was to act as though she had simply wandered past by chance. But then something unexpected happened. Maryjun spoke up. She pushed back against the girls directly, telling them that her mother was not what they were calling her. She told them plainly that what they were doing was wrong, and that they ought to be ashamed of themselves for ganging up on someone the way they were. When one of the girls demanded to know whether Maryjun understood what kind of position she was in, Maryjun stood her ground. She said she had done nothing wrong, and that judging a person purely by the circumstances of their birth only revealed how hollow the person doing the judging truly was. One of the ladies reached out toward Maryjun with clear intent, but Violet stepped in before anything could happen. The woman froze the moment she saw who it was. Violet bowed her head graciously and asked the ladies to excuse her little sister's behavior, explaining that Maryjun had only recently entered noble society and had not yet grown accustomed to the customs and expectations of the academy. She appealed to them personally, asking them to let the matter go for her sake and not to hold Maryjun's bluntness against her. Maryjun stood nearby, visibly taken aback by what Violet was doing. The ladies softened immediately. They told Violet there was nothing to forgive and insisted she need not bow to them, saying they trusted her completely. Violet smiled and thanked them warmly. She added one more thing before letting them go, assuring them gently that whatever reservations they might have, Maryjun's standing as a noble was legitimate, and they had no cause for concern on that front. The ladies were caught off guard by this, but composed themselves quickly and walked away without another word. Once they were gone, Violet turned to Maryjun and addressed her directly. She told her plainly that speaking so bluntly the way she had done was not wise, and that from that point forward, she needed to keep her rank in mind. Violet was already turning to leave when Maryjun called after her. Maryjun wanted to understand what Violet had meant. She asked whether, when people came at her with cruelty and insults, she was simply expected to say nothing and endure it. She could not see how that was right. Violet paused and turned back. She acknowledged that it was not right. But she pressed Maryjun further, asking her whether, each time someone held a view that clashed with her own, she intended to simply dismiss that person entirely. Maryjun's eyes widened slightly. Violet continued, explaining that there would always be people whose sense of right and wrong did not match Maryjun's, and that this was simply the nature of things. No two people would ever agree on everything. But as members of the nobility, they belonged to a class that carried a particular weight. Nobles were looked to as a standard, as people who stood above the common crowd and showed the way by example. Maryjun was a Vahan now, and she needed to remember what that meant. That responsibility, Violet told her, was what set nobility apart. With that, Violet excused herself and walked away. Maryjun was left standing alone in the quiet, turning over everything she had just heard. Neither of the two girls was aware that the prince had been nearby the entire time, listening from a hidden position. He too was left standing in silence after Violet had gone. Later, inside the academy, Violet dropped into one of the chairs and sat there heavily, wondering why she had done any of that. Her original intention had been nothing more than to defuse the situation as quickly as possible and slip away unnoticed. She had told herself she would stay out of things and keep a low profile. Yet somehow she had ended up delivering a small lecture to Maryjun in front of everyone. She could not quite explain it to herself. Girls passing nearby murmured to one another that Violet looked deeply troubled. She did not pay them any attention. Her thoughts had returned to what Maryjun had said during the confrontation, that judging someone purely based on the circumstances of their birth revealed the emptiness of the person doing the judging. Taken on its own, among people of common birth where rank played no role, those words would have been courageous and admirable. But inside the world of the aristocracy, that kind of thinking was a danger to the person who held it. Violet knew this from her own painful experience. She had gotten into endless trouble because of the way that world worked. She was not trying to protect Maryjun out of any particular warmth toward her. It was more practical than that. Since Violet was planning to leave for a convent, someone would need to carry the Vahan name forward with some dignity, and Maryjun was the one who would have to do it. As Violet sat there, a few girls who spotted her let out surprised sounds and greeted her quickly before hurrying off. Violet noticed something in that moment. Being alone was simpler and less exhausting than it used to be, but it had its own particular emptiness. She was perfectly fine during classes, but she had no idea what to do with herself once the school day was over. She wanted to stay away from her father's house for as long as possible each day. She found herself wishing she had something worthwhile to fill the time with. Then she overheard a pair of girls talking nearby about a charming little cafe that had recently opened in town. One of them mentioned that it catered to commoners, but the other insisted it was worth visiting, praising the tea and mentioning that their pancakes had already become something of a local legend. They talked about sneaking out to try it. Something in Violet lit up at the sound of it. She had spent so much of her previous life under constant scrutiny, always being watched and talked about, that she had given up on ever wandering around town freely. But things were different now. She could actually go. She could walk around and look at things and simply exist without everyone's eyes on her. The thought was more exciting than she expected. She made her way to the first-year classroom to look for Yulon. The students inside told her he did not appear to be there and offered to let her wait, but she declined and thanked them. Down the hallway, without her knowing it, the prince was also nearby, keeping himself tucked out of sight because he could not bear the attention that came with being seen among the first years. Both Yulon and Maryjun were first-year students. Violet wondered if Yulon had already gone home. She had been thinking about finding a way to thank him properly for standing up for her at the tea party. He was also one of the very few people she would have felt comfortable inviting somewhere. With no other obvious option, she decided to give up on the idea for the time being and began to head off. Then someone called her name. A short while later, Violet found herself seated in a room with a cup of tea in front of her. The butler who had led her there was dismissed, and she was left sitting across from the prince himself. She was completely thrown. She had been told that someone from the student council wanted to speak with her, and she had assumed it was Mila continuing their earlier conversation. Instead, she was sitting opposite Prince Claudia, the student council president, in total silence. She thought back to what Mila had said that morning about the prince being irritable, and now the prince had summoned her here, privately, just the two of them. She assumed this had to be about the tea party and braced herself for another scolding. This room carried memories she had not wanted to revisit. In her previous life, the prince had called her to this very room after discovering the full extent of her bullying of Maryjun. He had been scathing. He had told her that she had hurt her own sister simply because she had wanted his attention so desperately, and he had told her in no uncertain terms, and with a coldness she had never forgotten, that he would never choose her. She had deserved those words. Everything he had said had been true. Back then, she had been the one behind everything. But now things were different, and she sat very still, waiting for whatever was coming. The prince spoke her name, and she flinched slightly at the suddenness of it. What followed was the last thing she had expected. The prince apologized. He told her that he had accused her at the tea party without first making sure of the facts, that he had jumped to a conclusion without thinking it through, and that it had not been his place to pass judgment on her the way he had. Violet stared at him, barely able to process what she was hearing. She recovered enough to respond, telling him that there was no need for him to lower his head to her, and expressing concern about what it might look like if anyone happened to see. The idea of a prince apologizing to someone of lesser rank was deeply unusual. The prince said something quiet and almost to himself, as if something had just confirmed a thought he already had. Then he set the matter aside entirely. He told her to think of herself as his guest, and suggested they simply enjoy the tea together. Nothing more than that. Violet accepted this with as much composure as she could manage. But inside, the part of her that had been firmly set on becoming a nun was making itself heard. It reminded her, with considerable force, what her actual plan was. She was going to finish school, leave home, and take her vows. That was the path she had chosen. She reminded herself of this clearly and deliberately. Whatever she was feeling sitting in this room, it did not matter. She could not afford to become entangled with someone who was watched by the entire kingdom. She needed to stay the course. Violet's mind was still turning over the same question as she sat across from the prince. Her entire plan depended on keeping a low profile, staying out of trouble, and quietly making her way toward the convent when the time came. Sitting here having tea with the prince was the opposite of that. She needed a way out. A knock at the door interrupted the silence. When it opened, Yulon stepped in, and his eyes found Violet almost immediately. He explained that a classmate had mentioned she had been looking for him, so he had thought to check the council room. Violet did not hesitate. She reached out, took hold of Yulon's arm, and told him his timing could not have been better, pulling him toward the door with her. The prince looked startled. Yulon's face flushed. Violet turned back long enough to smile at the prince and thank him graciously for the tea before steering Yulon through the doorway and pulling it shut behind them. She let out a quiet breath. That had been far too close. Behind the closed door, the prince was left sitting alone, visibly caught off guard and at a loss for words. Later, the two of them made their way into town and found the cafe they had heard about. They ordered the pancakes, and when the plate arrived, Violet's face lit up at the sight of it. She thanked Yulon sincerely, thinking to herself that she had missed out on something like this for far too long. Yulon told her it was no trouble at all, but then he turned the conversation in an unexpected direction. He wanted to know why, after finally having a rare moment alone with the prince, she had chosen to leave with Yulon instead. Violet nearly choked. She asked him what he meant by that. Yulon looked at her with an expression that suggested he found her reaction somewhat unconvincing. He pointed out that chasing after Prince Claudia had practically been a defining feature of Violet's life up until recently. The reminder hit her, and the memories came flooding back. She recalled how she had spent so much of that previous year following the prince around, complimenting him at every opportunity, making sure she was visible to him whenever she could manage it. She had heard that the royal family was quietly considering noble girls from the Tanzanite Academy as potential candidates for the prince's future bride, and she had thrown herself into trying to be one of them. She had sought him out constantly, inserted herself into his path at every chance, and looking back on it now, she cringed. She had been painfully, embarrassingly relentless. She had not truly been in love with him. She could see that clearly now. Her father had been absent from the Vahan estate nearly all of the time, leaving it cold and joyless. She had simply been desperate for someone to love her. She had thought that if she could become the bride of a man the entire kingdom admired and adored, she might finally find something to smile about in spite of everything. She had approached the prince with that need driving her, not with any genuine feeling for him as a person, and in the end that path had led her straight to prison. Yulon called her back to the present, checking whether she was all right. She said she was and apologized for drifting off. She felt a quiet shame settle over her as she thought about how she had believed that kind of desperate fawning would ever amount to anything real. She had never truly cared for the prince. Everything she had done had been for her own sake. She told Yulon simply and honestly that she had no intention of pursuing Prince Claudia any longer. Maryjun, she said, was far better suited to him. The thought had barely left her mouth when something clicked into place in her mind. If Prince Claudia were to marry Maryjun, the Vahan family would be set for generations. And if the engagement happened while they were all still at school together, it would draw every eye in the kingdom toward that pair. In the glow of something that significant, Violet would be completely overlooked. She would become invisible in the best possible way. In her previous life, she had done everything she could to tear their relationship apart. This time, that same relationship could become the very thing that set her free. Nobody would spare a second thought for a girl slipping quietly into a convent while the prince's engagement to her half-sister was the talk of the kingdom. She would solve two problems at once. Yulon raised a practical concern, noting that Maryjun's mixed bloodline might make a legal marriage to the prince difficult given how strictly the royal family tended to guard such matters. Violet brushed past this, saying that Maryjun had everything that mattered. She was lovely, she was direct, she said what she thought. She suggested to Yulon that someone like that might be exactly what the prince needed, something fresh and genuine amid all the careful performances of court life. Yulon responded with something less than full conviction. Violet pressed on, almost talking to herself now, marveling that she had not thought of this sooner. If Maryjun were to marry the prince, then Violet disappearing into a convent would seem like nothing at all. No one would care. Her father would leave her alone. Everyone would have something far more interesting to focus on. Yulon, who had been watching her during all of this, suddenly told her she had something on her chin. He reached over without any ceremony and wiped it away himself. Then without thinking tasted what had come off on his finger. He noted that it was sweet. Then he added, in his easy and unhurried way, that if Violet believed it would work, then he believed it too. Violet blinked at him, momentarily distracted, and asked if he was quite all right. He seemed to catch himself, and simply repeated that whatever had been on her chin was sweet. She laughed despite herself. She turned her attention back to the plan forming in her mind. The prince was already drawn to Maryjun. She could feel it. This would not take long at all. She looked down at her plate and said aloud, with genuine feeling, that the pancakes were absolutely delicious. In Violet's mind, the engagement between the prince and Maryjun was her only escape from being sent to a convent. Meanwhile, at the prince's office, a knock came at the door and Mila entered, carrying paperwork for the following month's art festival. The prince seemed to have been expecting someone else, and when he realized it was Mila, he mentioned that Violet had not come around recently. Apparently, Violet used to try to force her way into the office every single day, though the butler would always stop her. Mila noticed that the prince seemed almost disappointed, and quietly found him very easy to read. He was clearly missing her, even if he would not say it. Mila then brought up the fact that Violet's younger sister had recently enrolled at Tanzanite Academy. The prince recognized who she was talking about, recalling the girl from a recent tea party. He thought back to the moment Maryjun had stood up for herself against the students who were picking on her. His only feeling on the matter was a simple hope that she would settle in comfortably. As he turned away, Mila studied him and quietly wondered whether he had any real interest in Maryjun at all. A week passed, and Violet was found sitting alone in her classroom, lost in worried thought. She could not understand why the prince and her sister had not grown closer. In her memory of the previous life, the two had fallen for each other almost immediately after Maryjun arrived at the academy. No matter what Violet had done to interfere back then, it had been useless, and the two had become engaged before she even had a chance to stop it. So why was nothing happening this time? Her thoughts were interrupted when Maryjun appeared with a cheerful expression, carrying lunch she had brought for the two of them. Violet was caught off guard. She had been deliberately keeping her distance from Maryjun in hopes of protecting herself, and she could not understand why her sister kept seeking her out. She tried to hint that Maryjun might prefer to eat with someone else, but Maryjun quietly admitted she had not made any friends yet. She then gently offered to leave if she was unwanted. Violet, aware that other students were watching, quickly stopped her. She knew that openly rejecting Maryjun would only make things worse and draw unwanted attention, so she agreed to have lunch with her. The two of them sat together outside at a small table with the lunch Maryjun had brought. Maryjun was bright and cheerful, admiring the sandwiches that their cook Marin had made by hand. As Violet sipped her tea, she turned the situation over in her mind. Ever since the day Violet had scolded her, Maryjun had seemed to grow attached to her. Her past self would have found that unbearable. But more pressing was the question of why things were unfolding so differently this time. Prince Claudia had not made any move toward Maryjun since the tea party. In her previous life, he had fallen for Maryjun on his own, without any effort on Maryjun's part. What had changed? Then it struck her. It might have been because of the way she herself was treating Maryjun now. In the previous life, Violet had made Maryjun miserable constantly, which had given her a fragile, sorrowful quality that seemed to draw the prince's attention. But now, sitting across from her, Violet could see Maryjun glowing with genuine happiness, perfectly at ease. The two of them were not falling in love at all. Violet felt a wave of alarm. She had assumed that staying quiet and out of the way would be enough for things to follow their natural course, but it was now painfully clear that this time was nothing like before. If the prince and Maryjun were not engaged by the time she graduated, the convent would become her fate. She pictured it vividly in her mind and felt a deep sense of dread. Yet she knew she could not go back to tormenting Maryjun. She needed another way. Then Maryjun mentioned the upcoming school arts festival, saying she had never attended one and was looking forward to it. She explained that one student from each class would be chosen to perform at the festival recital. Something in those words sparked an idea in Violet. She rose from her seat so suddenly that it startled Maryjun. In her mind, a plan had taken shape. She would push Maryjun into the spotlight herself and use the festival as an opportunity to capture the prince's attention for her. She would shape Maryjun into the most refined and impressive young noblewoman possible. She told Maryjun that she would coach her personally for the performance. A maid came rushing in, calling out for Lady Violet. Violet came running into her mother's room, desperate and pleading for her mother not to leave her. Her mother lay weakened on the bed and stretched out her hand toward Violet. But it was not Violet her mother was truly reaching for. Her eyes were searching for someone else entirely, for her husband, wishing it were him standing there instead. Then, all at once, Violet was jolted awake by a loud voice pulling her out of the dream. She opened her eyes and gasped. Maryjun, her maid, stood over her with a worried expression, telling her she had been crying out in her sleep. Violet sat up, caught her breath, and quietly said she was fine. It had only been a nightmare. Maryjun watched her with concern, but said nothing more. That same morning, the mood in the Vahan household was much lighter. Maryjun came bounding into the room where her parents sat, bursting with excitement over the news that she would be playing the violin at the upcoming arts festival. Her parents were overjoyed. She added that Violet would be giving her lessons starting that very day. Violet, caught slightly off guard, quickly confirmed it with a smile. She could already feel the conversation beginning to shift towards something she did not want to deal with. So she made her excuses and moved toward the door. Before she could leave, however, her father stopped her. He said he was pleased she was helping Maryjun and told her to do her best, though he made sure to add that even if Maryjun played wrong notes, poor teaching must not be allowed to bring shame to the Vahan name. Violet smiled politely and assured him she understood. The moment she stepped outside, however, her composure slipped and a wave of quiet irritation washed over her. She was tired of her father always needing to have the final word and finding a way to belittle her every single day. Maryjun came after her, and Violet turned to look at her. The maid's face was full of quiet worry, and she gently asked whether Violet was pushing herself too hard. Violet understood immediately that Maryjun was thinking about the nightmare. She told her not to worry, that she was perfectly fine, and apologized for having caused her concern. Then she said she was heading out and left quickly, preferring to walk to school alone rather than alongside Maryjun. Maryjun stood watching her go, her expression heavy. She quietly clenched her fist, the weight of something old and unresolved pressing on her chest. She had never been able to forgive this family for what they had done. Later that day at the academy, Maryjun stepped into the school's grand hall and looked around in amazement at how large and open it was. Violet explained that it was the biggest hall in the school, used for ceremonies and important events throughout the year. She had arranged permission for them to use it for practice over the course of a week, and she told Maryjun to meet her there after school each day. Maryjun had assumed they would practice at home, but Violet quickly dismissed the idea. She pointed out that practicing on the very stage where the event would be held would help Maryjun grow comfortable with the space and ease any nerves she might have. Maryjun found the reasoning sound and was genuinely touched, thinking that Violet had considered everything so carefully. In truth, Violet's real reason was far simpler. She wanted to avoid their father and the house as much as she possibly could. Violet got things underway by asking Maryjun to demonstrate her posture and play something straightforward to start. She had reasoned that since first-year students were taught specific pieces, the best way to make Maryjun stand out would be to refine her stage presence and the way she carried herself while playing. From a distance, Maryjun's posture actually looked quite good. But the moment she drew the bow across the strings, the sound that came out was jarring and painful to hear. Violet stopped her immediately. Maryjun apologized and explained that although she had been attending music class, her teacher had already told her she had no natural talent for the instrument. Violet was taken aback. She reminded herself that while aristocratic children typically learn the violin from a young age, Maryjun had grown up as a commoner and had only recently entered noble society. It was only natural that she would be starting far behind. Violet stepped in and took up the violin herself to demonstrate. She explained the basics, describing how the instrument should be held with firmness but without tension, and then she began to play. The sound she drew from it was smooth and assured, and Maryjun watched with wide eyes, completely captivated. Neither of them noticed that they were being watched from above. Mila had heard the music drifting through the theater and had followed it, surprised to find the two sisters together in such an unexpected scene. Shortly after, Prince Claudio arrived and found Mila lurking in the upper area. The prince asked what he was doing hiding up there and suggested they make their rounds through the halls. Mila explained what had caught his attention, describing how strange it was to find Lady Violet personally coaching Maryjun, especially given that Maryjun was the one selected to represent her class. The prince did not seem to find it particularly unusual. He remarked that regardless of the circumstances of their birth, it was natural for an older sister to guide a younger one. Mila gave him a long, thoughtful look, and the prince became self-conscious under his gaze. Mila then spoke carefully, acknowledging that what the prince said was true in a general sense. It was not unheard of for a nobleman to take a mistress, and sometimes children came from those arrangements. But Maryjun had been born outside of marriage, which meant the two girls were not sisters in any ordinary sense. Violet's mother, Lady Belrose, had fallen gravely ill when she learned of her husband's betrayal and had eventually died from the grief it caused her. Mila was well aware of the Vahan family's dark history. Looking at how warmly Maryjun spoke of and behaved toward Violet, he strongly doubted that Maryjun had ever been told the truth of it. He added quietly that it was surprising how much the prince resembled that situation, in a way. Elsewhere in the academy, a different conversation was unfolding. Someone had called out to Yulan, asking if he wanted to share a pie on the walk home. Yulan declined, saying he was occupied. His companion, Giaforte, a prince from a neighboring country, teased him by asking whether he had plans with his princess. Yulan was visibly irritated and told him to stop using that word. Jia explained that since he had never actually met her, calling her simply by her name felt impolite. Yulan told him to call her Lady Violet and nothing else. He also made it clear that he was not going to meet her, but that something was sitting uneasily in his mind, and he simply wanted to make sure she was all right. He walked off without another word. Jia remained where he stood, watching Yulan go, entirely convinced in his own mind that Violet was indeed Yulan's princess in every sense that mattered. Inside the classroom, Violet was informed that someone had come to see her and was asking for a moment of her time. When she looked up to see who it was, she flinched. It was Prince Claudius standing there. He acknowledged that she had been keeping herself busy lately, having taken it upon herself to help her sister prepare for the arts festival recital, and he asked how things were going. Violet was unsettled, unsure how the prince had come to know about that. She confirmed that it was going well, and the prince seemed pleased to hear it. He then told her he had come to give her something and held out an envelope toward her. Violet recognized it immediately. The prince explained that it was a ticket to watch the recital from the audience, reasoning that it would hardly be fair for her to spend the whole performance watching from backstage after everything she had done to help. He mentioned that there happened to be a spare seat available and offered it to her so she could enjoy the show properly. Violet studied the envelope and noticed the royal family's crest and stationery. It was a seat in the monarch's box. She turned it over in her mind. A spare seat. She was fairly certain that kind of seat would normally be reserved for the prince's future bride, so why was he offering it to her? She looked at his face and could read clearly that he expected her to accept it. But she was also very aware of what accepting would mean. If another student spotted her sitting there, the entire academy would be flooded with rumors before the day was out. She thanked him graciously and bowed her head, but returned the envelope to him with a polite refusal, telling him it was far too generous a gesture for her. The prince's eyes widened. He began to reassure her that as his guest, she would be looked after and treated with every consideration, but Violet cut him off before he could finish. She told him that was not her concern at all. What she was worried about was Maryjun. Her sister would be nervous, and Violet wanted to remain backstage where she could offer her support. She apologized for turning down his kind offer and suggested that there were surely many other young ladies at the school who would be delighted by such an invitation, and that he should extend it to one of them instead. Then she excused herself. Once she was away from him, her heart was hammering. She could hardly believe she had just turned down the crown prince to his face. But she told herself firmly that she could not let everything she had worked toward be undone now. She was not sure what the prince had really been hoping to accomplish by coming to her, but she decided it was better to keep her distance from him. The prince was left standing there, genuinely taken aback. He was not accustomed to being turned away. People had always sought him out, not the other way around. The sound of footsteps broke the silence. Yulan appeared at the top of the stairs and made his way down, his tone sharp and pointed. He remarked that it was unusual to see the prince speaking privately with a student, without a single servant present, and commented that the prince seemed to enjoy a remarkable amount of freedom. The prince looked at him and held the envelope a little tighter, saying that he had simply wanted to do something kind for Violet. Yulan was not moved by the explanation. He asked directly whether the prince had been paying attention to the Vahan family scandal, and then said plainly that the prince had a habit of doing things for people based on his own idea of what kindness looked like, without stopping to consider how those actions actually landed on the people receiving them. At the tea party, there had already been more than enough gossip circling around the Vahan family. By stepping in so visibly to defend Maryjun, the prince had only drawn more attention to both sisters. Maryjun had only recently joined noble society, and the prince had made a public display of shielding a girl who came from a common background. At the same time, he had essentially accused Violet of tormenting her sister in front of everyone. Yulan pressed further, arguing that the prince might have felt he had rescued Maryjun that day, but in truth all he had done was protect a girl who had not yet learned to protect herself. As a result, other girls were still targeting Maryjun, and she remained unable to hold her ground. Her situation had not improved in the least. If the prince genuinely wanted to help, Yulan said, he ought to be reaching out to Maryjun, not Violet. He then added that he was sure the prince was not entirely unaware of how mercilessly people could treat children born outside of wedlock. Something flickered across the prince's face at those words, and a memory surfaced in his mind, the image of a child in tears. Yulan went on to say that he personally had no particular feelings about whether Maryjun suffered or not, and that he did not care what the prince chose to do. But if Violet ended up carrying the blame for Maryjun's troubles, that was something he would not tolerate. Anyone who hurt Violet, he said, would have to answer to him. The prince went still. As Yulan walked away, the prince called after him, noting that Yulan had changed. He had never sought him out before, let alone spoken to him alone like this. Yulan replied simply that things were different now, and kept walking. The day of the festival arrived. After one performer finished, the host announced that the next act would be the daughter of Duke Vahan, young lady Maryjun. Maryjun stepped onto the stage with a bright smile and began to play. A murmur moved through the crowd. Her mother watched in quiet amazement. Members of the audience whispered to one another, noting how beautiful she was and expressing surprise that she had been raised as a commoner. Others acknowledged that despite her origins, the performance was something the Vahan name could be proud of. Duke Vahan watched his daughter in silence from his seat. Up in the monarch's box, Prince Claudia stood watching as well. Backstage, Violet observed everything from the wings. She thought to herself that things were going smoothly and that Maryjun had pulled it off. Before Maryjun had gone on, Violet had quietly checked everything around the stage, half expecting that some of the girls who had targeted Maryjun before might try something again. She exhaled with relief when nothing happened. A moment later, Maryjun came rushing backstage and found Violet. Her face was lit up with happiness as she asked how her piece had sounded. Violet replied that it was passable, keeping her tone measured. But Maryjun was beaming, crediting everything to Violet's coaching and pouring out her gratitude. Violet watched her and thought privately that Maryjun ought to be turning that kind of bright, sparkling smile toward Prince Claudia, not her. She reflected that Maryjun had truly been nervous, and that all Violet had really done was give her a few pointers. She had not expected Maryjun to absorb them so completely and thoroughly. But it was no surprise, really. Maryjun had a genuine natural talent. Violet found herself thinking that she wished she could go back and tell her past self not to waste any energy trying to outshine her, because it had never been a fair contest to begin with. Then they heard a voice nearby mention Prince Claudia's name and announce that his violin had been tuned, and that someone would escort him to the stage shortly. Violet's mind sharpened. The prince was the final performer. And then it struck her. He had just watched Maryjun perform. This was the moment. This was exactly the kind of opportunity she had been working toward, the chance for Maryjun to catch the prince's eye. Violet quickly told Maryjun to go and greet the prince, and Maryjun did so without hesitation. She approached him and cheerfully wished him good luck before he went on. Violet watched from backstage and immediately felt that the approach had been all wrong. Maryjun should have carried herself with elegance and grace, expressing genuine interest in hearing him perform, not offering a breezy word of encouragement like they were old friends. Still, the prince responded warmly, thanking her. Violet blinked in surprise. She had been watching from the wings, and despite how casually it had all played out, the exchange had gone better than she expected. She allowed herself a small flicker of hope. Perhaps Maryjun's performance had already left some impression on him. But before she could settle into that thought, something went wrong. As the prince moved toward the stage, the edge of his cape snagged on the corner of a wooden box and tore. The prince noticed it instantly. His attendants went pale with alarm. Maryjun gasped. And at that very moment, the host's voice rang out across the hall, announcing the entrance of Prince Claudia Crucis. Prince Claudia had torn his cloak. The attendants around him immediately fell into a panic. They called out for the wardrobe clerk and declared that the prince needed a replacement, but his clothes were specially made to order and there was nothing on hand. Someone frantically asked if anyone nearby knew how to sew. Violet's heart began to race, because she did know how. She had learned to sew during her time in prison, though at this point in the previous year, she had never once picked up a needle in her life. She hesitated. It would look deeply strange for a duke's daughter to have any skill in mending clothes. That was servant's work. She thought it would be far better if Maryjun was the one to step forward and save the moment. Maryjun had grown up as a commoner, and even though her family had been comfortable, it would be far more believable coming from her. But before Violet could think any further, the situation shifted on its own. One of the attendants erupted at the servant boy who had been near the box, placing the blame squarely on him. The boy dropped to his knees in apology. The attendant continued to berate him harshly, insisting that servants needed to be more careful and that what had happened was a serious disaster. Violet watched it unfold from where she stood, and then to her great surprise, Maryjun walked straight into the middle of it all and told the man to stop being so cruel. Violet had no idea what her sister thought she was doing. The attendant, clearly flustered, told Maryjun firmly that the prince was the heir to the throne and that she should not be making a scene over something like this. But Maryjun held her ground and said plainly that there was no reason to make the poor boy a scapegoat. The man muttered under his breath, baffled by her. He then demanded to know whether she was somehow blaming the prince himself for the rip. Prince Claudia, who had been listening to the whole exchange, stepped in and put an end to it. He acknowledged that Maryjun was right, admitting that he had been distracted and had not been watching where he was walking. He also said there was no use in scolding the boy over what had already happened. What mattered now was finding a solution quickly, because the audience could not be kept waiting much longer. He said that if there was no time to retrieve another cloak, he would simply walk out on stage with the tear as it was. Violet's stomach turned at the thought. Royalty could not appear in front of a crowd looking disheveled. She made up her mind in an instant and stepped forward, calling out to the prince. She walked up to him and told him to follow her, saying it would not take long. The prince was visibly surprised, but something in her manner made him go along with it without argument, leaving Maryjun behind as Violet led him into a nearby room. Once inside, Violet worked quickly and stitched the torn cloak back together. She apologized that she had needed to rush given the time, but she was fairly certain no one in the audience would be able to tell. As she worked, she was quietly grateful that she had thought to bring a small sewing kit with her, having packed it earlier out of concern that someone might try to sabotage Maryjun's gown before she went on stage. She had never imagined she would be using it for this. The prince was genuinely astonished that Violette knew how to sew and asked where she had learned. Violette smiled to herself, thinking of the real answer. It had been inside her prison cell, after the prince had once thrown a book at her. That was what she would have liked to say. Instead, she simply told him they were wasting time and pushed him back toward the door before he could press the matter any further. The attendants were already calling for him. The prince started to say something more but stopped himself, thanked her, and let himself be led back to the stage. Out in the crowd, a low murmur had settled over the audience, with people beginning to wonder if the recital was over. Gia, a prince from the neighboring country of Sina who had come along, was among them, stifling a yawn and complaining that he was hungry and that this sort of formal cultural event was the sort of thing only the dull upper class of Duralia could genuinely enjoy. Yulon, sitting beside him, calmly pointed out that Gia was hardly in a position to talk, being a prince himself. Gia countered that things were done differently back home. He then asked Yulon why he was sitting out in the general audience when the royal family had reserved a VIP seat for him. Yulon replied that minor royals were not required to sit in that section, and besides, he had known Violette would not be in the audience. If he had taken a VIP seat, getting to her side quickly in an emergency would have been far more difficult. Gia blinked, not quite following his reasoning. Yulon told him not to worry about it. The stage lit up brightly. The host announced the prince's arrival, and Prince Claudia stepped out holding his violin and performed for the full crowd. When he finished, the applause filled the hall. Meanwhile, backstage, Maryjun had gone to look for Violette, but could not find her. As she walked through the corridor, she overheard a conversation nearby and quietly looked over at the men talking. She recognized them as members of Prince Claudia's attending staff. One of them was still rattled from the earlier incident, and the other admitted he had felt the same way. They agreed they had no idea how they would have managed if things had gone differently, and that the prince had been gracious in not holding it against them. However, one of them was still clearly bothered by the way Maryjun had spoken up in defense of the servant boy, calling it an insult to stand there and take the boy's side. If the prince had walked out on stage with a torn cloak, the blame would have fallen directly on their shoulders. Then one of them asked who had actually fixed the cloak, and the other replied that it had apparently been Duke Vahan's eldest daughter who had taken it away. He assumed she must have quickly handed it off to a maid somewhere. Maryjun turned away quietly. Something Violette had once said to her came back to her mind. Violette had told her that when someone challenged her view, she had a tendency to dismiss them entirely, and that as nobility, their class held the authority to define what was right and wrong. They stood above commoners and were meant to guide them. They had to always set an example. Maryjun said nothing and simply stood there with those words turning over in her thoughts. Back at the backstage area, Violette had returned and could hear the sound of applause drifting in from the stage. She noticed that Maryjun was nowhere to be seen. A couple of the other young ladies nearby had already heard that Violette had something to do with getting the prince's cloak repaired and began asking questions, wondering whether she had been the one with him and whether she might have fixed it herself. Violette kept her composure and waved off the idea lightly, telling them they had very active imaginations and that she had simply happened to know there was a seamstress working in the next room. The ladies immediately accepted this and apologized, agreeing that of course someone like Violette would never be doing a servant's work. Violette laughed along with them, while thinking privately that it was a very good thing she had pulled the prince aside discreetly when she had the chance. When the ladies spotted the prince returning to the stage area and rushed off to congratulate him, they invited Violette to come along. She declined politely, saying she had other things to attend to. The moment reminded her of something, and her thoughts drifted back to a year ago. She had been so consumed with helping Maryjun lately that she had nearly forgotten what it had been like to be one of those girls herself. A year ago, it had been Violette standing on that recital stage, performing with the quiet hope that this might be the thing to finally catch Prince Claudia's eye. But when she looked up at the monarch's box, she had seen Maryjun sitting beside him, and she had watched with a hollow feeling as the prince's gaze settled on Maryjun and stayed there. The pain of that moment had been real, but Violette allowed herself now to look at it more clearly than she ever had before. Her motives back then had been entirely self-serving. Everything she had felt and everything she had done had been calculated to serve her own interests. Looking back on it now, she almost found it funny. At least the other girls chasing after the prince were doing so with straightforward hearts. By comparison, her own feelings seemed hollow. She had built up an image of Prince Claudia in her mind as the perfect man without ever truly trying to know who he actually was. She paused on that thought. Prince Claudia was honest to a fault, idealistic, and completely guileless. A well-meaning but somewhat naive prince. What she had felt for him had not really been a crush in any true sense. It had not been love either. She was not sure what to call it. Across the way, the prince had returned to the stage area and was being warmly received by a crowd of admirers. Someone presented him with a bouquet of flowers. Mila stepped forward and offered to hold the bouquet for him, telling the prince that his performance had been without flaw. Violette watched from a distance, and one clear, quiet thought settled in her mind. Whatever it had or had not been, Prince Claudia had genuinely been the first boy she had ever cared for. That much, at least, she could say with certainty. Back at the Vahan estate that evening, the family gathered and lavished praise on Maryjun's performance. Her mother called it lovely, and the Duke declared that the nobles in the audience had spoken of nothing but admiration for her, adding that he was proud to have such a gifted daughter. Maryjun laughed happily and gave full credit to Violette, turning to her sister and insisting it had all been thanks to her help. Violette smiled and brushed it off, saying she had barely done anything at all. The Duke then remarked that Violette had only coached Maryjun for a few days and that the quality of her playing was entirely the result of Maryjun's own effort and hard work. Maryjun looked as though she wanted to push back on that, but at that moment an attendant came in to inform the Duke of a message regarding an appointment the following day. The Duke excused himself, told Maryjun to get some rest as she had more than earned it, and left the room. Maryjun was left with no chance to say what she had wanted to say. Violette felt a quiet flicker of irritation. Her father had said exactly what she had known he would say. A few days earlier he had pressed down on her with expectations, and now, when something had actually gone well, the credit went elsewhere. She told herself it did not matter. She had never expected gratitude from him. Maryjun stood nearby and watched Violette in silence. Later, as they walked toward Violette's room, Maryjun gently asked if she could draw Violette a warm bubble bath and offered to wash her hair, scrub her back, and give her a pedicure as well. Violette stopped and looked at her, asking what had brought this on. Maryjun said simply that she thought Violette might enjoy being properly looked after for once, since she always bathed on her own. A little pampering seemed like a fitting reward for everything Violette had been working so hard at lately. Tears quietly formed in Violette's eyes. She was deeply moved and told Maryjun she would gladly take her up on that. Maryjun told her to leave everything to her, and then immediately pointed out, with a knowing look, that she could see at a glance that Violette had been neglecting her hair. Violette swallowed nervously. A little while later, Maryjun worked through Violette's hair with gentle hands, and Violette told her it felt wonderful and thanked her sincerely. She sat quietly and thought to herself that the only reason this house felt like home at all was because Maryjun was in it. Later, settled on her bed, Violette allowed herself a small smile. The arts festival had not gone without its share of unexpected moments, but her plan to draw Prince Claudia's attention toward Maryjun seemed to be working. She let out a slow breath and told herself that was one less thing pressing on her for now. She simply hoped nothing else would go wrong. Her mind drifted briefly to the prince, and she found herself wondering what he had been on the verge of saying before he had been called back to the stage. A knock at the door pulled her out of her thoughts. Assuming it was Maryjun, she called out for whoever it was to come in. She was surprised to find Maryjun standing in the doorway. Maryjun greeted her and apologized for the interruption, saying she hated to disturb Violette while she was resting, but asked if she might have a moment. Violette agreed, though something inside her immediately felt uneasy about it. Maryjun asked if they could speak in her room, and Violette barely managed to suppress a groan as she got up to follow her. In Maryjun's room, Violette was invited to sit wherever she liked while Maryjun prepared tea for them, reasoning that since they had only just eaten, Violette probably was not hungry. Violette sat and turned the situation over in her mind, wondering what she had walked herself into and why Maryjun had wanted to bring her here, of all places. She reminded herself that she could have said no, but if her father had found out she had refused, it would not have gone well. She resolved to hear whatever was on Maryjun's mind, and then return to her own room as quickly as possible. Maryjun brought the tea over and mentioned that she had been drinking it quite often lately and had grown genuinely fond of it. She added quietly that Maryjun brewed it better than she did. Something stirred in Violette at those words. In her previous life, she had thrown tea just like this across the room, calling it cheap and demanding to know who had dared serve her such a thing. She remembered that it had been her mother who used to make tea for her, always telling her warmly that Violette preferred it a certain way. The memory of her mother settled over her gently as she held the cup in her hands. Maryjun's voice brought her back, asking with some concern whether the tea was too strong. Violette told her it was wonderful. She gave herself a quiet scolding for having let her thoughts wander back into the past again. Maryjun looked visibly relieved. Then she looked at Violette and mentioned that she had been thinking carefully about what Violette had said to her before. She admitted that Violette had been right, that her rank had changed, and therefore her behavior and way of carrying herself needed to change as well. She acknowledged that she had been naive and foolish in some of her reactions. At the same time, she said honestly that she did not think what she had said or done in those moments had been wrong. It still troubled her that a person's rank had such a large effect on how they were treated by others. But she had decided she would try to give the nobility more of the benefit of the doubt than she had before. She said she was beginning to understand how much pressure noble life placed on people. She was still unsure in her own mind about where the line between right and wrong truly sat, but she had made a decision. She was going to do her very best to become a proper daughter of the Vahan family in every sense. Violette was completely silent. She gripped the fabric of her clothes without realizing it, and when Maryjun noticed and called her name, Violette told her it was nothing. Maryjun apologized for having called her over when she must be tired and suggested they call it a night. Violet thought to herself that she had known coming here was a mistake. Then Maryjun asked softly whether she might invite Violet over again sometime. Violet said yes, and wished her good night. Maryjun looked startled for a moment, then broke into a warm smile, and returned the good night. Violet walked back to her own room with a troubled expression weighing on her face. She turned her thoughts over quietly as she went. Maryjun was pure and guileless. She was beautiful on the inside just as much as the outside. If only they were not sisters, Violet thought. She could have loved Maryjun as easily as anyone else would. But their father adored Maryjun, and his blood ran in her veins just as it ran in Violet's. That was something Violet could not look past. She would not let herself love Maryjun. She could not. Because the moment she did, she knew with a quiet and painful certainty that she would not be able to stop herself from also resenting her. She closed her eyes and made a silent plea inside her heart, asking Maryjun to forget about her, to let go of the sister who would one day disappear from her life entirely. Later, at the prince's office, a stack of envelopes was set down on the table. Mila explained that they were thank you notes that had arrived from people who had attended the arts festival. The prince told him to leave them and said he would go through them later. Mila's attention then drifted to something draped across the sofa. He recognized it as the cloak the prince had worn during the recital, the one that had been torn. He remarked that the servants had told him what had happened and what a difficult situation it must have been. It would have been quite a sight for the prince to walk on stage in a damaged cloak. And yet someone had repaired it so swiftly and so cleanly that the work was impressive by any measure. The prince told him it had been Violet. He explained that he had been prepared to go out on stage with the rip, but Violet had mended it in a matter of seconds. Mila took that in and said it made perfect sense to him now. He suggested that it sounded very much like something Lady Violet would do, watching for an opportunity to step in and endear herself to the prince when he was in a difficult spot. He remarked that she had always kept a close eye on the prince. The prince disagreed. He said that a week ago he might have thought the same thing, but not anymore. Mila asked what had changed. The prince thought back quietly. He recalled how in the past, Violet would have used any moment near him to draw attention to herself, mentioning a new gown for an evening ball or finding some way to keep herself in his line of sight. But what she had actually said to him recently was something entirely different. She had told him plainly that he deserved someone far better suited to him than herself. The prince told Mila that he no longer believed Violet had any feelings for him. Mila's eyes went wide. The prince's own words continued to echo in his mind. He no longer believed Violet had feelings for him. He had assumed that the change in her behavior had come about because of her mother's death, since she had once been almost unbearably calculated in everything she did around him. But lately she seemed to pay him no particular attention at all. Mila then asked him, with careful gentleness, whether it was possible that the prince himself might be in love. The prince reacted immediately, and Mila asked whether he was wrong to suggest it, because that was very much what he was hearing in the prince's own words. The prince looked away and tapped his foot restlessly against the floor. Mila then spoke seriously, reminding him that he would one day be king of Duralia, and that if the prince truly believed Violet was the right woman to rule beside him, then as both his friend and his retainer, Mila would arrange it. The prince could have anyone he wished. The prince clenched his fist tightly. Mila lowered himself to one knee, but the prince said nothing. Something was holding him back. Meanwhile, in the dining hall, Violet was sitting alone eating when someone asked if he could take the seat beside her. It was Yulon. He mentioned that he had not expected to find her there and had looked for her in her classroom first without any luck. Violet apologized and hoped he had not spent too long searching for her. Yulon pulled out the chair and sat down, remarking that it was still unusual to see her eating in the dining hall. Violet flinched slightly and agreed, saying it was a nice change every now and then. In her mind, however, she wished she could be eating somewhere else entirely. The truth was that ever since the night she had visited Maryjun's room, she had been quietly dodging Maryjun's invitations to have lunch together. She wondered if perhaps she should have helped Maryjun find some friends before pushing her and the prince toward each other, but that would have been a complicated thing to arrange. She had come up with excuses so far, though she knew she still needed to find a quieter spot to eat where she would not run into as many people. Yulon looked down at her plate and pointed out with concern that what she had there was barely a meal. He warned her that she would faint if she did not eat properly. Violet assured him she was fine and noted that she was having dessert. Yulon then pointed out, very plainly, that she appeared to be having only dessert. Violet cleared her throat and argued that she still got her fair share of nutrients since she did eat her vegetables. Yulon asked her if that was not only really true when Maryjun was around to make sure of it. Violet felt completely cornered. At that moment, Gio appeared and made his way over, mildly put out that Yulon had not let him know where he was sitting. He had spent time searching the entire dining hall for him. Both Violet and Yulon noticed immediately that Gia's tray was piled and practically high with bread. Yulon remarked on how much he had taken again, and Gia said he had simply grabbed a large amount to save himself the trouble of going back and forth. Yulon told him not to come complaining to him later when he had eaten too much. Gia dismissed the concern and then suddenly noticed Violet sitting there. He leaned his face in close to hers with open curiosity and asked aloud whether she was Yulon's princess. Violet was baffled by the question. Jia continued studying her with great interest and said that it all made sense to him now, nodding as though he had just solved something. He laughed and declared that it explained perfectly why Yulan was so protective of her. Yulan grabbed him and firmly told him to stop using that word. Jia asked what he was supposed to call her instead. Violet, still trying to make sense of all of this, asked whether Jia was a friend of Yulan's. Yulan apologized to her on his behalf. Jia then introduced himself cheerfully, explaining that he was not from Duralia, but had been friends with Yulan since their middle school days. Violet asked whether he was from Sina, and Jia was visibly surprised that she had guessed correctly. Violet pointed to the pendant hanging around his neck and asked whether it was amber. She explained that Sina's amber mines were well known and that the stone was one of the country's most celebrated exports. Jia was impressed and called her well informed, referring to her again as princess. Violet asked him plainly why he kept using that word. Jia said he was not sure what else to call her, given that Yulan had talked about her endlessly and had never quite settled on a way to refer to her. Violet suggested he simply call her Lady Violet. Jia whined that he did not really seem like someone who went around calling people by formal titles like that. Violet told him he could call her whatever he liked, but that using the word princess might give people the wrong idea. Jia thought for a moment and proposed Miss Violet as a compromise, turning to Yulan to check whether that was at least acceptable. Yulan said it was not, though he made clear that the title itself was not really the issue. Jia leaned toward Yulan and whispered that he was being terribly possessive. Violet caught this and was quietly surprised. She had never seen this side of Yulan before. The Yulan she knew always wore a gentle, calm expression. Seeing him like this, a little flustered and unguarded around a friend, felt unexpectedly refreshing. Later, the three of them were walking down the hallway together, and Violet told them they did not need to walk her all the way back to her classroom, though she thanked them both for the company. Just as she was about to step inside, Yulan called after her and brought up the fact that exams were coming up soon. He asked if she might be able to lend him those materials again. Violet said of course and told him she was fairly sure she had copied everything down and would bring it all the next day. Jia, who had been listening, asked what they were talking about. Violet explained that she meant the previous year's exam questions. The Royal Tanzanite Academy was a highly regarded school and only brought in instructors of the highest quality, which meant that staff turnover was very low. As a result, the exam questions tended not to change very much from one year to the next, and it had quietly become a tradition among older students to pass the previous year's questions along to their classmates as a study aid. Jia said he had not been aware they did that. Yulan then asked Violet whether she was busy, adding that he had some questions about certain class notes and wondered if she would be willing to tutor him, but only if she had the time and it was not too much trouble. Violet thought it over. She remembered that in her previous life she had crammed entirely on her own, driven by the desire to outshine Maryjun and impress Prince Claudia. She had still lost in the end. There was no reason to push herself in that same desperate way this time around. She did not want to let her grades slip and face her father's disapproval, but she also knew she already had the advantage of having sat through these exams once before. And besides, the idea of studying alongside Yulan held a quiet and uncomplicated appeal. She agreed to tutor him. Yulan stopped walking. Then a smile broke across his face, open and unguarded, and he thanked her warmly, calling her by the shortened name Vio. Violet then added that Jia was welcome to join them as well. Jia asked whether she really thought he was someone who needed tutoring. Violet took one look at him and quietly concluded that he probably did not. She told Yulan they would meet after school the following day, and he agreed. The two of them exchanged a small, easy smile. Neither of them noticed that someone was watching from around the corner. It was Mila, standing quietly in the shadows, turning something over in his mind and wondering to himself what he ought to do about what he was seeing. It had been only 3 months since Violet had gone back in time by a year, and she was finally beginning to settle into the strange new shape of her life. She and Yulan had made plans to study together for the upcoming exams, but somehow, things had not gone the way she had imagined. The scene around her told the whole story. Yulan was at the table beside her, working through a question he was not quite sure how to approach and asking for her help. Nearby, Prince Claudia was sitting with Maryjun, quietly pointing out that a different tense would work better in one of her sentences. Maryjun took the correction eagerly and confirmed the change she was making. Mila, meanwhile, had positioned himself near Violet and was cheerfully telling her not to hesitate to ask him anything she needed. All of them were seated together at a single table. Violet stared at the scene and asked herself how on earth this had happened. An hour earlier, things had been beautifully simple. It had just been the two of them, Violet and Yulan, sitting in the school library, with Violet going through the material and Yulan working through problems on his own. Violet had looked over his paper at one point and noted with some surprise that he had followed every step correctly and should be able to tell for himself whether his answer was right. Yulan had apologized but admitted he could not help checking with her, confessing with a light laugh that if he had got it right, there was always the chance she might say something encouraging. He had gone back to his paper with a happy, satisfied look. Violet had sat back and let the quiet settle around her. It had felt genuinely peaceful. That was all she had been working toward since coming back, a life that was calm and ordinary. She had been very glad she had agreed to study with Yulan that day, and she had found herself hoping quietly that the feeling could last. Then Maryjun had appeared. She had come into the library and spotted Violette immediately, making her way over to their table with her usual bright energy. She had wondered aloud why she had not been able to find Violette in the library at their home, not realizing until now that Violette had been studying at school. She noticed Yulan and caught herself, apologizing in case she was interrupting something. She recognized him from the class next door, introduced herself warmly, and greeted him. Yulan said hello. Maryjun then asked whether the two of them were studying together, and when Violette explained that she had agreed to tutor Yulan, Maryjun lit up and asked if Violette could help her as well. Violette immediately wanted to blame herself for having said anything at all. Maryjun then noticed the previous year's exam questions they were working from and exclaimed that she had not known that was something students did, and that no one had told her. Violette told herself firmly that her peaceful afternoon was gone. But she also knew that if Maryjun went home and mentioned to their father that Violette had refused to help her while happily tutoring Yulan, the consequences would be unpleasant. She was grateful that Yulan did not seem to mind the addition, and she reminded herself that making sure things went smoothly for Maryjun was part of her larger plan anyway. It was not a disaster. It was manageable. Yulan gently asked whether Violette would need to borrow a set of questions from a third-year student for herself. She told him she would be fine. Maryjun looked worried on her behalf. Violette brushed it off privately, knowing it was true. She had studied so intensely the first time around that much of the material was still embedded in her memory. And besides, no matter how well she performed, she knew the attention in the household would settle on Maryjun regardless. There was no point pushing herself to exhaustion over it. Then another voice entered the picture. Someone offered to get Violette the questions if she needed them. She turned to look and felt a jolt of surprise. It was Prince Claudia. He asked Mila whether he still had the questions from the previous years, and Mila confirmed that he had kept the last 5 years' worth and could retrieve them in just a few minutes. Violette was already puzzled about why the two of them were in the student library to begin with. She quickly told Mila that she could not possibly borrow anything from the prince and that she would not dream of asking such a thing. The prince said he did not mind at all and that he had no one among the second years to lend them to anyway. Violette started to push back, but the prince simply asked whether she had some objection to borrowing his copy. Violette became very conscious of the people sitting around them and conceded, addressing him properly by name, that she had none. Mila then asked whether Violette might prefer a quieter place to study, since they had been on their way to do the same. He explained that the student council's private library was nearby and that it happened to be where all the exam materials were kept. He extended an invitation to all of them to join. Violette was stunned. She could not believe what she was hearing. And so, somehow, they had all ended up in the student council's private library together. That was how it had gone so completely off course. Violette sat among them and wondered why a simple tutoring session had turned into this. She made every effort to keep to herself and avoid unnecessary entanglements. And yet somehow she was spending more time around people than ever before. She had set 3 rules for herself when she had come back to relive this year. She would not argue with anyone. She would not bully anyone. And she would not get involved with anyone romantically. Somehow, all 3 were being tested just by sitting in this room. The prince had pointed out early on that Violette would not be able to study properly if she was trying to tutor both Yulan and Maryjun at the same time. He had offered to help Maryjun himself and suggested that Mila assist Violette if she had any questions. Violette had not expected the prince to offer that, but she could not pretend it was unwelcome. This was precisely what she had been trying to engineer. Maryjun would have the chance to show the prince how capable and quick she was, and the two of them would naturally grow closer. It was 2 things at once, handled without any effort on her part. Then a thought crossed her mind. Was it possible that the prince had suggested the group study session precisely because he had wanted to be near Maryjun? The thought sat with her for a moment. Yulan called her name and said he needed a little help with something. She came back to herself and walked him through it. He said it made sense and thanked her. Her mind drifted briefly to what she knew about Yulan's history. The Kugers family had served as Duralia's prime minister for generations, but Yulan's true father was King Gabriella Acrusis himself. The king had already been married and had an heir in Prince Claudia, so Yulan had been quietly adopted by a childless branch of the royal family, content to remain in the background as second in line. In that way, Yulan and the prince were half-brothers, just as Violette and Maryjun were half-sisters. But the nature of the distance between the 2 young men was something only they themselves could truly understand. She was pulled out of her thoughts when Yulan pointed out that she had stopped writing and asked if she was tired. She said no and tried to find something to say. Before she could, the sharp snap of a book closing broke the quiet. Mila rose from his seat and announced they should all take a short break and that he would go and get everyone something to eat and drink. He turned to Yulan and casually asked if he would mind giving him a hand. Yulan looked uncertain. Mila smiled and explained that he could hardly ask the ladies to help, and that someone from the student council needed to remain present while the private library was in use. He also added, with another easy smile, that Yulan was surely the only one who knew what Violette liked. Yulan found he had no real response to that, and went along with it. Violet watched them go and thought quietly to herself that Mila might be trying to give Yulon a moment to clear his head and shake off any discomfort he had been feeling. She called after Yulon and encouraged him to take the chance to stretch his legs, noting that the room had grown a little stuffy and that stepping away for a bit would do him good. She added that breaks were genuinely important when studying and that moving around would help him stay sharp. Yulon was convinced by this and agreed, saying that if Violet said so, he would. Violet smiled. Mila, on his way out, cheerfully told the remaining three to enjoy their break as well. The door closed behind them. Violet looked up and then felt the full weight of the situation settle on her. She was now sitting alone in the room with Prince Claudia and Maryjun. Violet told herself that sending Yulon off to get snacks had seemed like a reasonable idea at the time. But now that it was just the three of them left in the room, the air felt thick with awkwardness. She noticed that Maryjun had gone quiet and was looking directly at her. Then she realized that Maryjun was not staring out of discomfort at all. She was simply beaming, quietly thrilled to be sitting there studying alongside Violet. Violet felt a flicker of exasperation. Maryjun should be turning that bright gaze toward the young man sitting right next to her. Learning to carry herself gracefully in situations like this was exactly the kind of thing a noble woman needed to practice. As for the prince, he sat in complete silence and found the whole situation deeply uncomfortable. After a moment, the prince broke the quiet by asking Violet if he could get her thoughts on something. Violet was caught slightly off guard but told him of course and asked what was on his mind. The prince explained that the country which supplied the tea served in the student lounge had recently been hit by an unexpected cold snap. The frost had damaged the tea leaves, and he needed to find a replacement variety for the time being. Since the student council covered the cost of everything purchased for the lounge, he was looking for something of roughly the same quality and price as what they usually served. It was not something he had needed to think about before, as there had never been any issue with exports from that region, so no backup had ever been chosen. He asked whether either of them knew of something that might fit. Maryjun jumped in immediately, saying that Violet knew a great deal about tea. The prince looked over with interest and asked whether that was true. Maryjun confirmed it eagerly, saying that one of their kitchen staff had mentioned recently that Violet was genuinely knowledgeable about all kinds of tea, and she looked at Violet as if to hand the moment over to her. Violet smiled calmly and asked which variety the lounge typically served. The prince told her it was Makith. Violet turned this over in her mind. Makith was a refined and highly regarded tea, extremely popular among the nobility and considered one of the finest blends available in Duralia. Very few teas could genuinely stand beside it in terms of quality. But thinking carefully about the time of year, she suggested they consider Cardina instead. The prince recognized the name and recalled that its leaves were grown in a small country to the southwest. Violet confirmed this and explained that because the country exported less than larger producers, Cardina was not widely known and was therefore priced lower than Makith. That said, it happened to be in season right now. While harvesters typically dried the leaves for sale throughout the year, at this particular time, they also sold fresh leaves, which made for a particularly exceptional cup. Violet found herself murmuring almost to herself that Cardina was absolutely delicious, her voice carrying a genuine warmth that she had not quite intended. The prince's eyes lit up with curiosity. He said it sounded very much like her favorite. Violet flustered slightly and tried to recover. The prince said he had made up his mind and would order a crate of Cardina for late spring. Violet was surprised and asked whether he was truly comfortable choosing a tea based solely on her personal preference. The prince nodded and said it seemed like a perfectly good opportunity to try something new. After all, he added, it was part of a noble's duty to seek out and appreciate things of quality that had not yet been widely discovered. He then asked her simply whether she truly did love Cardina, since she had praised it so warmly, and that alone made him want to try it for himself. Violet found herself without words. She brought her hands gently to her chest and thanked him sincerely. The prince's cheeks flushed with a faint color. Violet thought to herself that being able to drink Cardina at school would feel like something out of a dream. She was very glad she had mentioned it. Maryjun sat beside them, looking genuinely impressed by Violet's depth of knowledge. The prince, for his part, said nothing more. He sat quietly with his thoughts, his fist closed at his side. Out in the hallway, Mila and Yulon were making their way back with trays of refreshments. Mila called after Yulon and told him to slow down, or he would trip walking at that pace. Yulon told him not to worry about him and to simply keep up. Mila remarked that Yulon was very blunt and then acknowledged, with a mild tone, that Yulon probably did not feel the need to mind his manners around him particularly. Yulon stopped walking and said plainly that being agreeable toward Mila did not do anything to help Violet, so there was no point in pretending otherwise. Mila observed that Yulon had not changed at all, that everything he did and thought still revolved entirely around Lady Violet. Yulon was caught off guard and turned to face him, asking directly whether Mila had been the one behind all of this. He said he had known something fell off, that it was too convenient for everyone to end up in the same library at the same time. Mila said Yulon was giving him far too much credit, that he had had nothing to do with Maryjun appearing when she did. Yulon told him flatly that whatever he was up to, He had only gone along with the situation at Violet's encouragement and had no interest in playing any part in Mila's schemes. Mila smiled and said quietly that Lady Violet had grown remarkably charming lately. Yulan went completely still. Mila continued, noting that not long ago Violet had been petty and self-focused, very much like so many other young ladies who pursued Prince Claudia for the status and wealth that came with him. But ever since her younger sister had arrived, the change in Violet had been striking. She had become humble. She carried herself with a kind of quiet dignity that felt genuinely noble, and it had not gone unnoticed by the prince. The Violet that Mila had been observing lately, he said, was someone who would be a fitting match for Prince Claudia. Yulan had stopped walking entirely. Mila asked whether something was wrong, suggesting it should not come as such a surprise. Violet was of high rank, and her beauty and conduct were both more than suitable. Part of Mila's responsibility, he explained, was to observe the young women in the prince's circle and ensure that when the time came, the prince made a wise choice. By every measure he cared about, Violet would be a good match. And beyond that, the Vahan family was still weighed down by scandal. The rumors had not fully died down, and plenty of students still whispered about Violet behind her back. But if she were to become engaged to the crown prince, all of that morbid gossip would dissolve into envy overnight. Mila said he was quite sure that Violet herself would be delighted by such an outcome. There was a sudden loud thud. Yulan had struck his fist against the wall. Mila's eyes went wide. Yulan said he had known it all along and declared bluntly that both Mila and the prince were fools. He asked whether they honestly believed that was what Violet wanted. It was plain to anyone paying attention that Violet was keeping her head down deliberately, that she was tired and simply trying to live quietly. He said he would only ever do what Violet herself wanted. That was the whole of it. Trying to push him aside or frighten him off was a complete waste of time. He told Mila to understand that, and then said they should move quickly so Violet was not left waiting. Mila asked him once more, gently, whether he was truly at peace with that. Yulan was already walking ahead of him and said nothing more. Inside his own thoughts, however, the answer was far from simple. There was nothing in the world that mattered more to him than Violet. That had been true ever since a particular moment he could not put out of his mind. If Violet herself were ever to choose him, he would. But he never finished the thought, because just then he stepped through the door and saw Violet laughing. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes wide. Violet pushed back her chair and came toward him, welcoming him back warmly and thanking him for going to the trouble of getting the snacks, asking with light concern whether the tray had been heavy. He told her he was fine and asked what they had all been talking about while he was gone. Violet told him cheerfully that it had just been different kinds of tea. Mila came through the door behind him and thanked everyone for their patience, announcing that they had brought juice and pastries from the dining hall and that everyone should have something before returning to their books. Both Violet and Maryjun looked genuinely pleased at the sight of the food. Yulan looked across the table at the prince, but said nothing. Later that afternoon, as the session came to an end, Violet thanked the prince for everything. He told her there was nothing to thank him for and noted that Maryjun had managed most of the questions on her own. Violet said that having someone to study with truly did make a difference. Maryjun excused herself to go and meet with one of her teachers. Violet then turned and thanked Mila as well. Mila told her warmly to take care on her way home and offered the same to Yulan. Yulan gave a casual word of thanks and walked straight to the door. Violet noticed the sharpness in his manner but said nothing about it, offering her thanks to the student council once more before stepping out and pulling the door closed behind her. The prince and Mila remained inside and exchanged a small wave as she left. The prince stood quietly, lost somewhere in his own thoughts. On the other side of the door, Yulan turned with surprise to find that Violet had followed him out. He looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. His eyes glistened, and he closed his hand into a fist at his side, saying nothing at all. As they walked down the hallway together, Yulan noted that it had gotten quite late and asked whether Violet needed to rush home. Violet told him she had already let Maryjun know she would be out late studying, and since she was with Maryjun, her father would not have any reason to complain. Yulan said he understood and seemed relieved to hear it. But Violet could see that something was weighing on him. She apologized to him. He looked at her, confused. She explained that their original plan had been to study on their own, and then Maryjun had come along uninvited. She hoped her sister's presence had not thrown Yulan off. And then on top of that, the student council members had shown up as well, making everything even more complicated. As Violet slumped slightly under the guilt of it, Yulan quickly told her that none of it mattered and that she should not blame herself. He said he had genuinely not minded, and if anything, he was the one who owed her an apology, since she had been the one being thoughtful about him the whole time. He told her not to worry and made it clear that he was not upset in the least. He was simply happy that they had been able to study together at all. But then he hesitated. There was something else. He admitted, with some difficulty, that he felt a little frustrated with himself, because he had been the only person there who had not been able to help Violet with anything. He was always the one asking her for favors. He could not tutor her, and he knew nothing about tea. And yet he wanted very much to be someone she could lean on. He might not be able to help with everything, but he wanted to be useful to her in some way. Then he seemed to pull himself back from the weight of the thought and offered something lighter instead. He remembered that the cafe they had visited together before had a new seasonal special. As a way of thanking her for studying with him, he said he would take her there once exams were finished. Before he could say anything more, Violet reached out and took hold of his arm. He looked at her, startled. She told him he was wrong. She said she had never had the chance to say it to him directly, but she wanted him to hear it now. She had kept herself going at Tanzanite Academy, had held herself together and pushed through, because of him. Knowing that he was there for her had meant she never truly felt alone, even in her most solitary moments. His smile had made it possible for her to keep smiling. Yulan stood very still, barely able to take in what she was saying. She smiled and told him that his eyes had always been a source of steadiness for her. They were so gentle, and in certain light they seemed to shimmer. They reminded her of the sun. She reached up and touched his face softly, confirming to herself what she had just said. She told him they were breathtaking. Yulan could not find a single word to say, and then she pointed out quietly that there it was, the shimmer she had been talking about. Something moved deep inside him. Those words. She had said the exact same thing to him once before, with that same luminous smile. His mind traveled back 7 years. He had been very young, pushed into a corner somewhere and crying, while a group of noble children stood over him and mocked him. They called him a bastard and told him not to get ideas above his station just because the color of his eyes resembled the prince's. They sneered that his eyes were nothing like the prince's, that the gold in them was cheap and common, a lesser color that meant nothing. Then came the sound of boots striking the floor, quick and purposeful. A child in a cloak appeared and stood before them. The other children immediately recognized her and said her name out loud. Violet. Violet had addressed the group calmly and apologized for interrupting, explaining simply that she had overheard them and had not been able to stop herself from coming over. Yulan had looked up, confused at first, because she had short hair and at a quick glance could easily have been mistaken for a boy. But he had not thought she was a boy at all. He had thought she was beautiful. The children who had been tormenting Yulan looked at her, and she looked back at them with a steady, unwavering gaze. That was all it took. They turned and ran. Violet had then looked down at Yulan and extended her hand toward him. She asked if he was all right, and said that since he was hurt, he should go to the infirmary, though she admitted she did not know where it was herself. Yulan had looked up at her and, haltingly, asked whether she truly liked his eyes. He told her that everyone hated them, that they were guilt-colored and marked him as something people resented. Even after he had been adopted into a noble family, one glance at those gold eyes was enough for anyone to know he was the king's son. He had spent a long time wondering why they had to be that color. Violet had crouched down closer to his level and said simply that she had been bullied too, and by her own mother. Then she had looked at him with quiet clarity and told him that no one could truly become someone they were not, or remake themselves into a false version of another person. Yulan was real. He was himself. That was not something that could be taken from him. He had been completely stunned by her words. She had leaned in a little closer and told him she had been right, that his eyes were magnificent, like the sun itself. In that moment, she had looked to him more beautiful than anyone he had ever seen. After that day, he had followed her everywhere, trailing after her like a devoted little brother. He had been there for picnics, for walks, for afternoons spent reading together. Whenever he caught sight of her, he ran to her side and stayed there. She always welcomed him with a warm smile and open arms, and he could not help but be near her constantly. It was only later, when he was older, that he came to understand what that feeling had really been. There was a day he had gone looking for her, expecting to find her in the garden where they had planned to read together, but she was not there. Then he noticed something and moved toward one of the windows. Through it, he could see Maryjun helping Violet get dressed. Violet was asking Maryjun to pull her clothes tighter. Maryjun told her it would hurt her. Violet said it was fine and asked her again. Maryjun had no real choice but to do as she asked. Yulan had quickly stepped back from the window, his heart pounding, feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath him. He had been so unaware, so completely blind to what had been happening. The very words that Violet had once used to save him, the belief that no one should have to become someone they were not, had been words she herself was unable to live by. The truth she had given him as a gift had been slowly tearing her apart. By the time middle school began, Violet had stopped wearing boys' clothing. Her mother, Lady Belrose, had never been able to accept the fact that her daughter was growing up and becoming a young woman. She locked herself away in her room and rejected Violet for failing to remain the image of the Duke that she had tried so desperately to preserve. Yulan had been unable to do anything. He had hated himself deeply for how powerless he was. He had wanted to save her and could not. And around that time, Violet began to change. The beauty he had first seen in her never left, but her personality slowly twisted into something painful to witness, shaped by years of neglect and loneliness and a desperate need to be loved by someone who would not give it. He had told himself that the least he could do was stay close and be there for her when she needed him. But then Violet had told him about the Crown Prince, about how she had fallen for him, about wanting desperately to be loved by someone the whole world adored. In the end, she had not chosen Yulan. Even so, he had told himself it did not matter. If she was happy, that was enough for him. If the prince could give her what she needed, then he would accept it. Violet's voice pulled him back to the present. She had noticed he had stopped walking and asked if he had forgotten something. He apologized and told her his thoughts had wandered off on their own. He said he had been imagining where they might celebrate once exams were over and asked if he could think of a good place. Violet laughed softly and teased him, pointing out that exams had not even started yet, and here he was already making plans. But she told him that when the time came to celebrate, she wanted him to be the one to choose where they went. He started to brush off the idea, but Violet told him not to be ridiculous, reminding him that she still had not properly thanked him for stepping in at the party, and insisting that the choice was his to make. He agreed, but inside, something had hardened into a quiet resolve. He had believed for a long time that he had made peace with things, that Violet's happiness was all he wanted, and that he could let her go wherever that happiness led her. But what had happened when he had left that happiness in the prince's hands had ended in something unspeakable, a conclusion so painful he could not fully form the words for it, even in his own mind. He would not allow that to happen again. If the only other path forward was one where the prince took her from him, then this time, Yulon was going to make his move. The professor stood at the front of the room, holding a stack of papers in her hands. It was the last exam of the term. Every student sat in silence around her. When it was over, she told them all they had done well. Violet let out a long breath of relief. As she made her way down the hallway afterward, she reflected quietly that she had sat through these same exams once before, and yet she had still managed to forget a fair number of the answers. All things considered, though, she did not think she had done too badly. She passed by Yulon and Gia, who were standing together talking, and the moment Yulon spotted her, his face broke into a wide, happy smile. He called out to her and asked if she had finished, then congratulated her warmly. Violet thanked him and asked with a small pang of guilt whether he had been waiting for her, apologizing if he had. She turned to Gia as well and offered her congratulations. Gia thanked her easily and mentioned that he had finished his exam early and had spent most of the remaining time napping. Yulon suggested they head to the cafe before the crowds arrived, and Violet agreed readily. She then turned to Gia with a look of mild surprise, saying she had not realized he had such a taste for sweets. Gia looked confused by the comment. Violet asked whether he was not coming along with them to celebrate. Gia laughed and shook his head, saying he had no intention of getting in the way. He explained that he had only needed a quick word with Yulon, and now that they were done, he was heading home. He clapped Yulon on the shoulder with a grin, whispered something that sounded very much like a wish of good luck, and walked off with a cheerful wave. Yulon shot him a sharp look as he went. Violet glanced at Yulon and asked whether Gia had needed something. Yulon told her not to worry about it. They arrived at the cafe a little while later. Violet told Yulon she was surprised he had known about the new item on the menu, since he was not someone who usually ate sweets. He explained that he had overheard a girl in his class mention it, and that the new addition turned out to be a special pancake. Violet's eyes lit up immediately. A small gasp escaped her, and a flush of excitement rose in her cheeks before she caught herself and pulled back from the feeling with a quiet exclamation of embarrassment. Yulon pulled out a chair for her and offered her the seat. She sat down and thanked him. He smiled at her, and for a moment she found herself at a loss for words. She thought about it as she settled in. As children, she and Yulon had spent so much time together, and she had always thought of him as something like a sweet younger brother. But sitting across from him now, she noticed how differently he carried himself. There was an ease and a grace to him, and whenever they were together, he was quietly and naturally courteous in a way that she had somehow never paid attention to before. The chocolate pancake arrived and Violet's eyes went wide with delight. Later, as they left and she began to descend the steps outside, Yulon called her name and told her to watch where she was stepping. He reached out his hand. She took it without thinking and thanked him as she came down. She turned the moment over in her mind as they walked. Yulon had always been warm and considerate toward her, but she found herself wondering when exactly he had grown into such a gentleman. She told him it was his turn to choose where they went next. He seemed momentarily caught off guard, as though he had forgotten she had asked him to think of places. He said he had given it some thought, and while the next spot was not exactly exciting, he needed to stop in somewhere to run a small errand. Violet told him she would come along. When they arrived, Violet looked around and asked if it was a stationery shop. Yulon explained that his pens had been wearing out and that he always brought them to this particular shop to have them repaired. The shopkeeper greeted Yulon with familiar warmth as they came in. Yulon approached the counter and handed over 3 items he had brought with him. Violet found herself remembering something. While they had been studying together, Yulon had mentioned that one of his pens had been giving him trouble. She looked at the portfolio he had also set down and pointed out that he had been using it since middle school. She asked whether making regular trips to this shop to look after his things was simply a habit of his, noting that she had always left that sort of thing to Maryjun to handle. Yulon said that people often told him it would be simpler to just buy something new, but he had used that portfolio for so long that he had grown genuinely attached to it. It held a kind of sentimental value for him. He said that he wanted to take care of the things that mattered to him, and that if something could be repaired, he would rather keep it and look after it for the rest of his life. The word stayed with Violet for a moment. She told him sincerely that she found that wonderful. She said that because Yulon treasured his things so deeply, she was sure those things were happy to belong to him. Yulon was visibly caught off guard by that. A faint blush crossed his face as he asked whether she really thought so. Violet smiled and told him she did. Then she noticed something on one of the shelves nearby and told him she was going to step over and take a look. Yulon stood quietly, without a single word to say. The shopkeeper broke the silence by telling him he would get started right away and that everything would be ready in about an hour. Violet was pleasantly surprised that it would be done so quickly. Yulon explained that the shop had built its reputation on being both fast and thorough in its work. Violet said she understood and remarked on how convenient that was. Yulon agreed, adding that it made the shop easy to stop by on the way home from school. He glanced around briefly and murmured to himself that an hour was not too long to wait. The two of them stepped outside. Yulon asked Violet whether she had much time to spare. She thought it over and checked her watch, deciding that it was still early enough. Yulon said it would be dull to simply stand around outside the shop for an hour and suggested they go somewhere and sit down for a while. Violet agreed. He was about to say something more when Violet's attention shifted and she called his name. She had noticed that he was not wearing his watch and asked what had happened to it. Yulon hesitated before admitting that he had lost it a couple of days ago. Something came back to Violet at those words. Yulon was meticulous about his school things, but his watch was a different story entirely. He had always had a habit of misplacing it. She could remember finding it left behind at her house or at school more than once and returning it to him each time. She came back to the present and pointed out that this must be the fourth time it had happened. Yulon corrected her, admitting with some embarrassment that it was closer to the sixth. Violet exclaimed that that was even worse. He said he knew, but he genuinely disliked wearing a watch. It got in the way of his movements, and even though the band was the right size, it always felt too tight around his wrist and made it stiffen up uncomfortably, especially when the watch knocked against something. Violet could see why. Yulon was tall and broad, with thick wrists, and it was easy to imagine how irritating that would be. He added that he did not really need a watch at the moment anyway, since he could track the time well enough from the school bells and the clocks in the classrooms. Violet pointed out gently that it was still useful to be able to check the time when he was outside of school. He admitted that she had a point. She told him she understood where he was coming from, since she was not particularly fond of wristwatches herself either. Then something occurred to her. She held her bag and told him she had an idea. She asked whether he needed to go anywhere else before they killed time, and when he asked if she was tired, she shook her head and said she was perfectly fine. She looked up at him, reached out, and took his hand, pulling him along and telling him to come with her. Yulon was completely caught off guard by the sudden contact. He said her name in a flustered stammer, and she turned back to look at him. He asked what was on her mind and whether there was somewhere she wanted to go. She told him yes, that she wanted them to go and find his reward together. Later that afternoon, they found themselves stepping into a clock shop. Yulon had not even known the place was there. Violet said it was her first time visiting as well, but that someone had once mentioned to her that her own pocket watch had been made there. She told him that a pocket watch would suit him much better than a wristwatch, since he could clip it to his school bag or simply keep it tucked safely away. And since he had worked so hard for his exams, she was going to buy one for him. She began looking through the display, noting to herself that many of the watches on offer would look good on Yulon, which only made the choice more difficult. She moved from one to the next, considering and dismissing, and when she glanced back at him, she found him standing behind her with a quiet smile on his face, not looking at the watches at all. She asked whether he was actually paying attention. He told her warmly that he would be happy with whatever she chose. Violet said that was not the point. He was the one who would be using it, and the whole purpose of being there was to find something he himself genuinely liked. He conceded and turned his attention to the display more seriously, saying that he mostly cared about how well something worked and had never really chosen anything based on how it looked. Then an idea came to him. He asked if he could have a look at her pocket watch to give himself some sense of direction. She handed it over without hesitation. He studied it quietly, noting that there was a small jewel set into the center, a pale blue stone that was understated but genuinely beautiful. He said it suited her and asked if it was aquamarine. She nodded. Maryjun had given it to her as a birthday gift when she was still in her early school years. She remembered how surprised she had been when she realized the gift was for her. Maryjun had placed it in her hands and told her to think of it as a good luck charm. It had been the first present she had ever received that made her feel truly seen and loved for exactly who she was, not for what someone else wanted her to be. Yulon took that in quietly and murmured that in that case, he could not possibly choose the same one. Violet asked what he meant by that, but he told her to forget it and turned back to the display. He looked from watch to watch, unsure, and then something caught his eye. He said her name softly and nodded toward a particular piece. Violet followed his gaze. It was a watch decorated with a delicate floral design, the flowers small and elegant across its surface. Yulon pointed out that the flowers were violets, just like her name. Violet said yes, and mentioned that her grandfather had apparently been the one to name her. She looked at the watch again, a pocket watch with a violet motif, and let out a small laugh as she began to understand why he had said it reminded him of her. Yulon said he wanted that one. Violet looked at him in surprise. He asked whether she thought it was a good choice. She said it was a beautiful watch without question, but wondered aloud whether it might be a little too ornate and delicate looking for a young man. Yulan said he intended to follow her example and make the watch his own good luck charm, just as Maryjun's gift had become hers. Violet looked at him for a moment without speaking. She told herself that as long as Yulan liked it, the decorations were beside the point, and that was that. She then asked him seriously whether he would take proper care of it. Yulan replied that unlike his wristwatch, this was one thing he would never lose or leave behind somewhere. Not ever. Violet looked at him and remarked, with a dry but fond tone, that was honestly a rather low standard to set for himself. The man behind the counter handed Yulan the bag containing his purchase. Yulan's face lit up with genuine warmth. He turned to Violet and thanked her for everything that day, promising sincerely that he would take good care of the watch. Violet laughed softly and said she was glad they had found one he truly liked. Yulan pointed out that the celebration was supposed to have been for both of them, and yet she had ended up spoiling him with a gift. Violet brushed this off, insisting that the pancakes had been more than enough and that she had thoroughly enjoyed them. She said her goodbyes and made to leave, but Yulan stopped her suddenly, telling her there was something he wanted to give her. Violet turned back with a curious look. Yulan opened his palm. Resting in it was a beautiful hairpin. He admitted that suggesting they celebrate had partly been his way of finding the right moment to give it to her. Violet's eyes went wide. It was an amber hairpin, delicate and lovely, and she immediately wondered aloud whether this was what he and Gia had been quietly discussing earlier in the day. Yulan confirmed it, explaining that Gia had done him a favor and helped him get it sorted. He went on to explain that while the amber might look ordinary at first glance, it had actually been carved from Peace's mind in Gia's homeland. Violet looked at it closely and noticed privately that it had the same warm golden sheen as Yulan's eyes. Yulan's expression turned a little shy as he admitted that although he had framed it as a gift, the truth buried underneath was simpler than that. He had just wanted the two of them to have something that matched. Violet thanked him with a full and radiant smile, telling him she was truly delighted and that she would treasure the hairpin. Yulan was momentarily caught off guard by the brightness of her expression. Then he smiled back at her, and that was that. Later that evening, back at the mansion, Maryjun came to Violet's room and offered to comb her hair before she went to sleep. Violet thanked her. As Maryjun worked gently through her hair, she asked whether Violet had enjoyed her day. Violet said yes, that she had had a great deal of fun, and her face softened and brightened as she said it. Maryjun was quietly struck by the sight of her. It took her a moment before she smiled to herself and said it was wonderful to hear. She told Violet she would come to wake her in the morning and wished her a good night's sleep. Violet stopped her just before she reached the door. She asked whether, from now on, Maryjun could use a particular hairpin whenever she pinned her hair back. She held it out for Maryjun to see. Maryjun looked at it and said of course, without hesitation. Violet thanked her again. After Maryjun left and the room was quiet, Violet sat on the edge of her bed and let out a slow breath. Her thoughts settled gently on the hairpin. She had worn it before, in her previous life, before she had traveled back in time. She had never imagined she would receive it again. So much had unfolded differently since she had come back a year into the past. There were moments, more and more of them lately, when she almost forgot that she had already lived through this once before, that she had already failed. She was growing comfortable, and that was dangerous. She needed to stay careful and keep her true purpose firmly in mind. She closed her hand into a fist and held on to that thought. And yet, she could not help but notice something that puzzled her in a quiet and tender way. To receive the same gift twice should have felt ordinary, or even bittersweet. So why, she wondered, did it make her so much happier this time around? Down the hallway, Maryjun walked slowly back toward her own duties, her thoughts turning over something she could not quite set aside. It struck her deeply that Lady Violet was smiling again inside this house. She had not seen her look so genuinely cheerful since the day she had given her that pocket watch all those years ago. And yet, knowing that it was someone else who had put that smile there tonight stirred something complicated in her chest, something that felt just a little like being overtaken. She reminded herself that she knew Yulan Kyugers well. He had come by the house often enough in years past, and she trusted him to a reasonable degree. But it was her duty, above all else, to protect her beloved mistress, and that was a responsibility she did not take lightly. She thought again of Violet's expression that evening, so open and unguarded, and something in her softened even as it ached. It was difficult to admit, even to herself, but she knew in her heart that it would not be her own hands that ultimately guided Lady Violet toward the life she deserved. That was not the role that had been given to her. What she could do, and what she quietly resolved to do, was this. When the time finally came, she would make sure that the right person was placed beside Lady Violet in the position that mattered most. Whoever that person turned out to be. Mila approached the prince and asked whether he could work through another stack of documents as well. The prince looked at the pile and complained that there was still so much to get through. Mila explained that everything had backed up while they were in the middle of exams. The prince sighed and remarked that Tanzanite Academy had a number of customs that would seem completely foreign anywhere else. The student council was a prime example of this, he said, since nothing like it existed at schools in other countries. Mila agreed that student government was indeed a rare thing, and mentioned that from what he had heard, it had been established by a king a couple of generations back. The prince nodded, saying that the intention behind it had supposedly been to teach young nobles to value independence and to think for themselves. He admitted that political theory genuinely interested him. But then he set that thought aside and said firmly that the two of them simply could not keep managing everything on their own. It was unreasonable to expect that of just two people. Mila pointed out that the last time they had tried to bring more members into the student council, the response from the female students had been overwhelming and chaotic, with everyone pushing forward at once to be considered. It had been a complete mess. He then asked, in a carefully measured tone, whether the prince had perhaps already found someone he might want to invite into the council this time around. The prince went quiet for a moment. Then he told Mila to forget it and said nothing more. Maryjun looked around with wide, excited eyes and called out to Violette, pointing out the grandeur of everything around them and asking whether she did not find it all thrilling. Violette felt entirely the opposite. She let out a quiet sigh and agreed flatly that yes, it was indeed something. She turned the question over in her own mind, wondering how things had ended up this way. The Royal Tanzanite Academy held an annual summer retreat each year, a long-standing tradition in which a select group of noble students were invited to spend time at the summer palace. As Violette walked through the hallway earlier, she had overheard another young lady gushing with excitement about the retreat and mentioning that she had already bought a new dress for it. Violette knew the retreat for what it truly was beneath all the pageantry. It was designed, at its heart, to give the royal family an opportunity to observe suitable prospects for the crown prince. The last time she had been invited, she had been beside herself with joy and had thrown herself into preparations with everything she had. But none of that appeal remained in her now. She had made up her mind firmly that she would not be attending this time. She clenched her fist with quiet determination, picturing instead a calm and peaceful holiday away from all the pretense and performance of aristocratic life. The thought of it genuinely excited her. Staying at home on her own, however, might grow lonely. Perhaps she would spend the time visiting Yulan. She was still lost in these thoughts when someone approached and addressed her by name. She looked up with mild surprise. It was Mila. He apologized for stopping her and explained that he was following up on the summer retreat invitations, asking whether it was true that she did not plan to attend this year. Violette collected herself and replied that she had heard the summer would be on the cooler side and that she intended to spend it relaxing indoors at Yulan's home. At that moment, a sharp gasp came from nearby. Maryjun had overheard and appeared beside them, dismayed at the news that Violette was not coming. Violette was caught off guard by her sudden presence. Maryjun's face fell immediately, and she said quietly that if Violette was not going, she would rather not go either. Violette stared at her, barely able to believe what she was hearing. She told Maryjun firmly not to be foolish about this, that as a newly established member of the nobility, attending the retreat was something she absolutely had to do. Maryjun countered that she had never been to the retreat before and did not really understand what all the excitement was about. And besides, she added, Violette would be right there at home, and there was still so much she wanted to do with her. Violette stood frozen for a moment, the full weight of the situation pressing down on her. If Maryjun stayed behind because of her, she would be stuck looking after her the entire time and would have to be pleasant about it. The thought of it was genuinely awful. She reversed her decision on the spot and announced that she would be going to the retreat after all. And so here she was. Maryjun's excited voice pulled her back to the present, calling out that there were musicians playing in the garden. Violette stood nearby looking deeply uncomfortable. She had steeled herself before the trip, accepting that she would essentially be keeping an eye on Maryjun for the whole of it. What she had not counted on was Yulan falling ill and having to drop out at the last moment. Now Maryjun was the only person she had to talk to. Still, she reminded herself, this was an opportunity she should not waste. Lately she had been losing sight of what she was actually working toward. Her plan, quiet and steady, was to keep her head down until she was old enough to enter a convent and slip away from noble life entirely. But for that to work, things needed to fall into place with Maryjun and Prince Claudia, just as they had in her previous life. If Maryjun were welcomed into the royal family, the Vahan name would enjoy prosperity and security, and her father, along with everyone else, would turn their full attention to Maryjun and leave Violette in peace. It was worth any amount of effort to make that happen. She was prepared to support Maryjun in whatever way she could. She called Maryjun's attention and pointed out that Prince Claudio was standing not far away, suggesting she go and speak with him. Maryjun turned to look and asked with genuine innocence why she would do that. Violette felt a wave of disbelief wash over her internally. She was not misremembering things, was she? In her previous life, Maryjun had become the prince's fiancée. The prince's indifference toward Maryjun this time around made a certain kind of sense, since Violette had not been tormenting her the way she once had. But why was Maryjun showing no interest in the prince either? She needed to find out what was going on in her sister's head. She tried a different approach and brought up how Maryjun seemed to have settled in well at Tanzanite since enrolling. Maryjun agreed cheerfully that she had found her footing. Violette then asked carefully, trying to sound casual, whether any of the young lords around her had caught her attention. Maryjun seemed momentarily puzzled by the question. Violette tried again, reminding her of the study group they had all shared before the exams. Maryjun's face lit up at the memory, and she immediately said that Yulan was absolutely wonderful. Violet blinked, thrown completely off course. Maryjun went on to praise him warmly, saying how gracious he was with everyone around him and that his exam results had come in first in the entire class. She had tried her very best, but had not come close to matching him. Violet absorbed this with surprise, thinking that Yulan must have studied extraordinarily hard. But then she caught herself. What about Prince Claudia? She tried once more, gently steering the conversation toward the other young men who had joined their study group. Maryjun replied without any hesitation that she honestly preferred Violet's company to any of theirs. Violet's eyes went wide. Maryjun continued, smiling warmly, saying that after the arts festival she had managed to make a few friends, but that everyone seemed to look up to Violet so much. She said she was genuinely proud to be her sister. The words landed on Violet like something heavy and unexpected. Proud to be her sister. She repeated it silently to herself, and then, barely above a whisper, the thought crept out of her unbidden. Even though she had once tried to kill her, Maryjun caught the murmur and asked in confusion what Violet had just said, calling her name again when she did not respond. Violet's face had gone quiet and guilty. She took a step away and told Maryjun to never mind what she had said. Maryjun asked where she was going. Violet cut her off and told her not to follow. She walked away carrying the full weight of what she knew. Maryjun had no idea what she was talking about. That was precisely why she could stand there and praise her so openly and warmly. She did not know, and Violet had despised her deeply enough, in another life, to want her gone entirely. The gap between those two things was almost impossible to sit with. Maryjun called after her once more. Violet asked her quietly but firmly to please leave her alone for now, and then she was gone. Two young ladies appeared a moment later and approached Maryjun with questions about the evening's banquet. Maryjun barely heard them. She murmured the same thought to herself again, the same quiet worry that had visited her more than once already. She had upset Violet again. She did not fully understand how or why, but she could feel it, and it sat heavily with her. Across the gathering, an announcement rang out through the room. Crown Prince Claudia Acrusis was being introduced, and the floor was given to him. The prince stepped forward, wine glass in hand, and began to address the assembled guests, thanking them all for coming to the Academy's summer retreat. The prince told the assembled guests that the evening ahead would be filled with good food and the chance to get to know one another. He acknowledged that under ordinary circumstances, approaching someone of higher rank without invitation was considered improper, but he asked everyone to set that aside for the evening and mingle freely. The hall filled with warm applause the moment he finished. Not far away, Maryjun was standing alone when the two ladies from before came looking for her. They asked whether she had seen Violet, explaining that they had not been able to find her anywhere. Maryjun hesitated, Violet's parting words still sitting clearly in her mind, the quiet but firm request to be left alone. She told the ladies apologetically that Violet had wanted some time to herself. The ladies reacted with great disappointment. One of them explained that she had been so eager to ask Violet about her relationship with Prince Claudia. Maryjun was visibly startled by this. The lady confirmed it eagerly, saying that she and her friend had been quietly rooting for Violet and the prince for some time now. After seeing the two of them together at the arts festival, they had become entirely convinced that something romantic was happening between them in secret. Maryjun stood there absorbing this with wide eyes and an expression of open shock. The lady went on, recounting how the prince had gone out of his way to visit a second-year classroom before the recital, and then how Violet herself had stepped in personally when the prince's cloak had torn. To them, it was obvious. The two of them had to be seeing each other. The lady sighed over how romantic it all was. Maryjun said Violet's name under her breath, her expression still full of disbelief. The ladies' excited voices suddenly drew an irritated reaction from somewhere nearby. Someone found the squealing completely unacceptable, retreating from it with sharp displeasure and pulling a companion along. The companion, a young woman referred to as Princess Rosette, said nothing. She simply watched the scene in silence before being led away. Elsewhere in the palace, a member of staff approached Mila with the guest list for the evening's banquet. Mila accepted it and quietly noted to himself that Lady Violet's name was absent. It had been reported that she was unwell and resting in her room. He had, however, spotted her younger sister out in the ballroom. Then a rustling sound from outside drew his attention toward the window. He looked out and saw Lady Violet walking alone in the garden below. He murmured to himself, with a quiet and knowing tone, that she had been clever enough to use the excuse of illness to slip away from the banquet entirely. Out on the balcony, Violet breathed in the stillness around her with a small gasp of pleasant surprise. The view was beautiful. She had not realized until now that the palace sat right along the coast, and a gentle sea breeze was drifting in around her. She had only meant to take a short walk through the garden and had not expected to stumble upon anything so lovely. But the peace did not last long. Her own words from earlier crept back into her mind without warning. The thing she had muttered under her breath in front of Maryjun, the fragment of a thought she had let slip. She was horrified with herself. Getting carried away in a moment was one thing, but letting something like that come out, even partially, was a different matter entirely. She told herself it was probably because Maryjun's cheerful declaration of pride in her had been so jarring and so completely at odds with everything Violet knew about what she had once done. Then other voices began to surface, older and darker. She heard the sharp command to seize her, to arrest Lady Violette. She heard her own voice from that time, screaming for them to let her go. She heard the accusation that it was all her fault, the rage that Violet had always taken everything from her, that she had everything and was still never satisfied. And she heard the wish, raw and terrible, that she had never been born. The memory pressed in around her like something with weight. Then a voice, a present and real one, said her name. Violet turned sharply. Prince Claudio was standing there, and he was looking at her with an expression of quiet concern, asking what she was doing out there. She stared at him for a moment, barely whispering his name. He asked again, more gently, whether she was feeling unwell, and began to offer to send his servants to assist her. Violet cut him off quickly, insisting she was perfectly fine. She explained that her room had been too warm, and she had come outside for some fresh air. Then she caught herself and asked what he was doing out in the garden himself when the banquet was still going on inside. The prince hesitated before answering. His mind briefly returned to what had happened just moments before he had come outside. Mila had pointed out to him that Lady Violette had been spotted walking alone in the garden without any companion. The prince had asked where her sister was, and Mila had said he was not entirely sure, only that he had seen the two of them together earlier in the day and that something must have happened between them since then. He also mentioned that Violet's usual companion had fallen ill and sent his regrets, leaving her without anyone. Mila had then looked at the prince with a calm and deliberate expression and told him he ought to go to her, that Mila himself would keep things in order inside. There was only one person at this retreat the prince truly wished to speak with, Mila had said quietly, and they both knew who that was. The prince told Violet simply that he had wanted a short break and that he was a little tired himself. Violet immediately took this at face value and thanked him earnestly, assuming he must have exhausted himself with all the arrangements for the evening. She gave a small bow. Then something else occurred to her, and she straightened up in alarm, realizing that this part of the grounds was likely reserved for royal use alone. She apologized quickly for wandering in without permission and said she would leave at once. But the prince reached out and caught her wrist. He told her to wait. Violet turned back to him in surprise. He looked at her steadily for a moment, and then he said that he did not mind her being there. Violet stood very still. In all the time she had known him, across 2 lives, his hand had never once touched her. More than that, he told her he would rather she stayed, and asked whether she might sit with him for a little while and talk. And now it was wrapped around her wrist. She could feel, beneath the warmth of his grip, that his hand was trembling, just slightly, in a way he was clearly trying to hide. Back in his bedroom, a maid came in to check on Yulon. She remarked that he was not someone who fell ill very often, and while it was wonderful that his exams had gone so well, she gently scolded him for pushing himself so hard and reminded him that his grades would mean very little if he worked himself into the ground. Yulon lay there in a daze, barely taking it in. She told him to call for her if he needed anything at all, and he thanked her quietly and said he would. After she left, he pulled himself upright and sat on the edge of the bed. He thought to himself with a groan that of all the times to catch a cold, it had to be now. The one thing he was grateful for was that he had not passed it on to Violet before falling ill. Maybe he really had studied too hard. He groaned again at the thought, and then something else crossed his mind. These had been the first exams Violet's younger sister had ever sat, and she had come in second place overall. He, meanwhile, had studied until he had given himself a fever just to finish first. He was left wondering whether she was simply a natural genius. After a moment of quiet, he murmured to himself that he hoped Violet was all right. Meanwhile, at the summer palace, Violet and Prince Claudio were sitting together on a bench in the garden. The prince's earlier request, asking her to stay and talk with him for a little while, was still echoing softly in her mind. It had made her heart stutter unexpectedly, but now that they were actually sitting there together, the air between them was completely still and heavy with awkwardness. Neither of them spoke. Then the prince broke the silence. He observed that the last time they had been alone together was in the student council room. Violet jumped on this immediately, relieved beyond measure that he had been the one to say something first. She agreed and scrambled inwardly to think of something to say in return, but before she could, the prince murmured something that surprised her. He said that Cardina had turned out to be an excellent choice. Violet blinked, not quite following at first. He reminded her that she had been the one to recommend the Cardina leaves, and that they had since begun serving it in the lounge. The response had been remarkable. Guests kept asking what tea was being brewed. Violet could barely contain her astonishment. The prince confirmed it, and added that he had tried some himself, and that it had lived up to every word she had said about it. He admitted it was a shame they had not discovered it sooner. He then told her that they were planning to bring Cardina into the student lounges as well, and that once it was available there, she should come and have a cup. Violet responded with immediate and genuine delight, saying she absolutely would and thanking him with warmth. The prince looked at her for a moment and then quietly stifled a laugh. Violet turned to him, startled. He told her, with a soft expression, that she had a way of going completely wide-eyed whenever tea came up in conversation. Violet's heart jumped and she fumbled, apologizing for her lack of composure. The prince told her there was nothing to apologize for, and that her enthusiasm was actually something he found uplifting. He rose from the bench as he said it, and there was a smile on his face, easy and unguarded in a way that caught her off guard entirely. Violet sat watching him, her heart still beating faster than she would have liked. She tried to reason with herself. Her pulse was probably racing simply because the prince was behaving so differently from everything she had known of him. In her previous life, he had never once looked at her like this. His warmth, his smiles, his patience, none of it had ever been directed at her. What came back to her, instead, were the memories of how he had truly been toward her. The coldness, the sharp dismissals, the way he had told her they had nothing to discuss and ordered her away. And then there were the things he had said about Maryjun, calling her the loveliest flower, speaking of her with open tenderness. And what he had said about Violet herself, after she had dared to suggest he consider her instead of her sister. He had laughed at her and told her plainly that no matter how much she tried to present herself well, she could not hide her ugly heart. The words ugly heart surfaced again and pressed against something tender inside her. Violet shoved the memories back down, her irritation rising. And what exactly was wrong with the prince and Maryjun? They were no closer to each other than they had been at the start. Why was the prince spending his time out here talking to her when the whole point of the retreat was to bring him and Maryjun together? She did not have time to waste on this. They needed to get themselves sorted before she graduated and entered the convent. Determined, she called the prince's name and put on a bright smile. She mentioned casually that Maryjun had actually been studying tea quite devotedly herself lately and suggested that Maryjun might be able to offer him even better recommendations. She offered to go and bring her sister over. In her mind, she was already thinking ahead. There was absolutely no point in him chatting with her. The retreat was the perfect opportunity to push the two of them together. She would step aside and give them the space to grow closer, and then everything would fall into place. But the prince said no. He told her it was quite all right. Every thought in Violet's head came to a complete stop. She stared at him, genuinely stunned. The prince continued, reminding her of the conversation they had shared about the cold front that had delayed shipments of the lounge's usual tea. Now that they were brewing Cardina, he explained, there was no longer any need to look for other alternatives. The prince added that Maryjun herself had already mentioned being knowledgeable about tea. Violet flinched inwardly, because that was true. She had said exactly that. The prince then asked, with genuine puzzlement, why Violet was bringing her sister up so suddenly and out of nowhere. Violet hesitated. She was burning with the urge to ask him directly why he had not even mentioned Maryjun on his own, but she held that back and stumbled forward with a different approach instead. She pointed out, somewhat awkwardly, that Maryjun was quite stunning, was she not? The prince looked at her with open confusion, clearly thrown by the comment. Violet panicked inwardly, wondering if she had been too blunt, and quickly tried to recover by steering the conversation in a slightly different direction. She began talking up Maryjun more carefully, noting that despite her common background, she threw herself into everything she did with complete dedication. She reminded him that Maryjun had come second in her class during the exams and had been overjoyed by the result, and that she had credited his tutoring sessions for her success. Violet suggested that this would be a perfectly natural opportunity for Maryjun to thank him privately, just the two of them. The prince repeated the phrase quietly, as though it had struck him as odd. He was silent for a moment. Then he told Violet plainly that she may have misunderstood the situation and apologized if he had somehow given her the wrong impression, but he had absolutely no interest in her sister. Violet went completely still. She could barely process what she had just heard. The prince continued, clarifying that the only reason he had helped tutor Maryjun was because Mila was not always the clearest or most thorough when it came to explaining things. It had been practical, nothing more. Violet's thoughts were racing. If he felt nothing for Maryjun, then what did that mean for everything she had been working toward? The prince's expression shifted then, and he seemed to be struggling with something. He clenched his fist and began to speak haltingly, his words coming out uneven and quiet, his face flushing deeply. He murmured that compared to Maryjun, he actually found Violet to be far lovelier. The words were stumbling and half-formed, barely above a mumble, as though saying them out loud was almost more than he could manage. Violet did not hear a single word of it. Her mind was somewhere else entirely, reeling from the revelation that the prince was not considering Maryjun at all. This was a disaster. Everything she had set in motion was falling apart. Then a bell rang out somewhere across the grounds. The prince seemed to come back to himself and noted that the banquet would be winding down. He told Violet she ought to head back indoors and excused himself, saying he needed to speak with a few remaining guests. Violet gathered herself and agreed, taking a step to leave. But the prince called after her and asked, with a careful and deliberate tone, whether he had made his feelings sufficiently clear. Violet froze. His feelings? She turned the question over nervously and landed on what she thought he must mean, that he was telling her, firmly, to stop raising the subject of Maryjun because she held no interest for him. She told him yes, that he had been perfectly clear. The prince let out a quiet breath, said good, and that was the end of it. Not far away, Maryjun had been wandering the grounds, unsure of what to do with herself after everything that had happened earlier. She had meant only to take a short walk, but had drifted all the way out to the gardens. Then she noticed a figure ahead of her and recognized the prince. She thought it was fortunate, since she could simply follow him back inside. But then she noticed a second person nearby, and she looked more carefully. It was Violette. The prince appeared to be coming from the direction where Violette was standing. And then, without warning, the words the two ladies had said to her earlier came flooding back. They had been so certain that Violette and Prince Claudio were seeing each other in secret, that everything pointed to a quiet and private courtship between them. Maryjun's face softened into a slow and knowing smile. After the banquet had ended, Violette was alone with her thoughts, and her expression was dark. She told herself in quiet despair that this was a complete disaster and that her head was spinning. She ran through what she knew. Maryjun and the prince were obviously not of equal birth, and yet in her previous life he had proposed to her regardless. All it had needed was that first spark between them. That was the whole reason she had pushed herself so hard to bring them together. The arts festival, the study group, coaching Maryjun on the violin, praising her at every turn. She had done all of it with this one purpose in mind, and yet the prince's words kept returning to her. He had no interest in Maryjun whatsoever. None. Violette turned this over and over. The only explanation she could find was that in her previous life, it had been her cruelty toward Maryjun that had drawn the prince's attention to her in the first place. His desire to protect Maryjun, to stand up for her, had been what had opened the door to his feelings. But in this life, without that same cruelty, there was no moment of rescue. No first spark. Which meant everything she had done so far had achieved nothing toward that goal. She had taught Maryjun the violin. She had sung her praises to the prince himself. And it had all amounted to nothing. The thought made her head pound. A voice nearby asked gently whether she was feeling faint. Violette looked up. A young woman was watching her with quiet concern, offering to call for help if she needed it. Violette blinked, caught off guard. She quickly reassured the young woman that she was perfectly fine and had simply been lost in thought. The young woman laughed softly and apologized for intruding. Violette insisted there was nothing to apologize for and thanked her sincerely for her concern. The young woman said it had been nothing at all, wished Violette a pleasant evening, and moved on. As she watched her go, Violette placed her. That had been Princess Rosette Megan of Lidos, the neighboring kingdom. She was a foreign exchange student, much like Gia, and Violette realized she had not known the princess was attending the retreat. The two of them had never really spoken before. From what little she had just seen, the princess seemed exactly as Violette might have imagined her. Then Violette caught herself sharply. This was not the time to be thinking about her classmates. At the rate things were going, her entire plan to eventually take the veil and disappear quietly from noble life was unraveling. She needed to think of something else, and quickly.